Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. I'd done it 100 times before, walking the forest paths alone in the dead of night. The quiet was something I'd grown accustomed to. No tourists, no curious kids asking dumb questions. Just me, the trees, and the occasional animal rustling in the brush. The peace of it was part of why I loved my job. But that night, something felt off from the moment I stepped out of the ranger station. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just nerves. After all, it was late, and I'd been up since dawn. The night shift wasn't uncommon for rangers, but it always carried a little unease, especially during the fall when the air turned crisp and the forest seemed to come alive with shadows. I started my route like always, walking the perimeter of the park's eastern trail. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, casting long shadows that danced with every step. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound. But halfway through the trail, I started hearing something else. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A soft rustling in the distance, too rhythmic to be wind and too steady to be any small animal. I paused, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The sound stopped when I did, which should have reassured me, but instead it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't until I started walking again that I noticed the sound had returned. This time, I focused harder, paying attention to it. It wasn't just random noise, it was footsteps, and they were perfectly matching mine. I turned quickly, shining my light into the woods, but the beam caught only the empty expanse of trees. Nothing moved. I swallowed hard, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was an echo, or maybe some deer had wandered too close, startled by my presence. Whatever it was, it didn't seem threatening. But that didn't stop the unease that had settled in my gut. I kept moving, my steps a little quicker now. The sound followed, quieter this time, like it was keeping pace with me but not wanting to be heard. I stopped again, and sure enough, the footsteps stopped too. This wasn't an echo. I'm not sure why I didn't radio for help then and there. Maybe I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe I didn't want to admit that something was seriously wrong. So, instead, I turned on my heel and kept walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread clawing at the back of my mind. After another 100 yards, the trail turned, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in my peripheral vision. A large, dark figure slipping between the trees. I whipped my flashlight in that direction, heart hammering in my chest, but the beam fell on empty forest. Nothing, no movement, no sound. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, like eyes on the back of my neck, watching my every move. I gripped the flashlight tighter and took a deep breath, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The woods could play tricks on you at night. Your mind could fill in blanks that weren't really there. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. The air felt thicker somehow, oppressive. Even the usual sounds of the forest, the crickets, the owls, had gone eerily silent. My hand hovered over my radio. I was about to call it in when I heard a low, guttural growl. It was so deep that at first I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, reverberating through the trees. It wasn't far. Maybe 50 yards off the trail. Instinctively, I backed away, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. My flashlight flickered, just for a second, but long enough to send a jolt of panic through me. I slapped the side of it, praying it wouldn't die on me now. Another growl, this one closer, and then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, but as it moved between the trees, its shape became clearer. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, hunched over slightly as it moved on 2 legs. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like a predator's. and though I couldn't make out its full features, I could see enough. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I recognized. The growl turned into a snarl, and the thing took a step toward me, moving with a slow, deliberate menace. My throat went dry. I took another step back, my mind racing. This wasn't something I was trained for. I'd dealt with wolves, bears, even the occasional cougar. But this was different. The radio crackled at my side, breaking the tension for just a second. I fumbled for it, bringing it to my lips with shaky hands. "And to base, this is Ranger Holt," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The radio emitted a sharp burst of static, followed by a low, distorted growl that mimicked my voice. "Ranger Holt," it repeated back to me, the words twisted and warped. My blood ran cold. That wasn't feedback, that was something else, something wrong. I stared at the radio in disbelief, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't wait for it to happen again. I bolted. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, tearing down the trail as branches whipped against my face and legs. The thing behind me let out a deafening roar, and I could hear it crashing through the trees, matching my pace. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to not look back, but I couldn't help myself. Just once, I glanced over my shoulder. It was chasing me, and it was gaining. I pushed harder, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the narrow trail. I knew the forest like the back of my hand, but in the darkness, everything felt disorienting. The trees blurred past me, and every shadow seemed alive, twisting and moving in the corner of my vision. I could hear its heavy footsteps, the snapping of branches as it tore through the underbrush behind me. Up ahead, I saw a fork in the trail. Without thinking, I veered right, heading toward a small clearing I knew led back to the ranger station. My legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. Not with that thing so close. Not with the growls growing louder with each passing second. I broke through the tree line into the clearing, gasping for air. My heart leapt at the sight of the ranger station's lights just beyond the trees. I was close. So close, but so was it. I could hear it now, crashing through the brush just behind me. I didn't dare look back again. I forced myself to keep moving, my legs shaking beneath me as I closed the distance to the station. My hand shot out, grabbing the door handle, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, panting and shaking, my back pressed against the door as if that alone could keep it out. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, what I had seen. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. And then, slowly, the world outside grew quiet again. I stayed there, listening, waiting for the sound of heavy footsteps or the growl that had haunted me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the distant hum of the generator and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, gripping the door handle as if my life depended on it. Minutes, hours. It felt like an eternity before I finally gathered the courage to move. I stumbled over to the window, careful to stay in the shadows as I peered outside. The clearing was empty, no movement, no glowing eyes staring back at me, whatever it was. It was gone, or at least it was hiding. I slumped into a chair, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. My mind replayed the events of the night over and over, but no matter how many times I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. What I'd seen, what had chased me, wasn't supposed to exist. It couldn't exist, but I knew what I saw, I knew what I heard, and I knew that whatever it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the next unlucky soul to venture too far into the woods. And next time, they might not be as lucky. Story 2. The mist was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. That's why, when I first spotted the massive figure through the haze, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd heard stories of Bigfoot sightings in these woods, but I never believed them. Until now. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for years. I love nothing more than losing myself in nature, away from the chaos of city life. This particular hike was supposed to be a simple day trip, a chance to clear my head and test out my new camera. The trail was well known, but not heavily trafficked, especially on a foggy Tuesday morning in late autumn. I set out just after sunrise, the cool air nipping at my cheeks as I made my way up the mountainside. The fog rolled in about an hour into my hike, but I wasn't concerned. I knew these trails like the back of my hand and had all the gear I needed. Plus, the mist gave everything an ethereal quality that I was eager to capture on film. As the day wore on, the fog only thickened. The familiar landscape transformed into something alien and foreboding. Gnarled tree branches reached out like skeletal fingers, and every rustle of leaves sent a shiver down my spine. Still, I pressed on, determined to reach the summit before turning back. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a dark smudge in the distance, barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees. But as I squinted through the mist, the shape began to take form. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and definitely bipedal. My heart began to race as my mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stood motionless, partially obscured by the fog and the thick trunk of an ancient pine. I could make out broad shoulders, a massive chest, and long, powerful arms that hung at its sides. But it was the head that sent ice through my veins. It wasn't the round, ape-like head I'd imagined Bigfoot to have. This was different, canine, with a long snout and pointed ears that stood erect atop its skull. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my camera. Whatever this thing was, I needed proof. I needed to know I wasn't going crazy. The heavy camera slipped through my sweat-slicked fingers, and I barely managed to catch it before it hit the ground. In that split second, as I looked down to secure my grip on the camera, everything changed. A twig snapped behind me, sharp and close. Too close. I froze, my fingers still wrapped around the camera, but no longer caring about taking a picture. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around my ankles as if trying to root me to the spot. Another snap, closer this time, then another. Whatever was behind me, it was big, and it was getting closer. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there like a statue. But fear had turned my muscles to lead. I couldn't move, couldn't think, could barely breathe. Hot, fetid breath washed over the back of my neck. A low growl rumbled through the air, so deep I felt it in my bones. Slowly, fighting against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I turned around and found myself face to face with a nightmare. The creature towered over me, easily twice my height. Coarse, dark fur covered its massive frame, matted in places with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Muscles rippled beneath its skin as it moved, radiating power and barely contained violence. But it was the face that would haunt me for years to come. Long, razor-sharp teeth gleamed in a mouth that seemed to grin with malicious intent. The snout was wolf-like, but longer, more pronounced than any wolf I'd ever seen. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They glowed with an unnatural amber light, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. This was no mere beast. This was something else entirely. A dogman. The stories were true. Time seemed to stand still as we faced each other on that misty mountain trail. My mind raced, trying to remember everything I'd ever heard about these creatures. Were they aggressive, territorial? Did they hunt humans? I had no answers, only a bone-deep terror that threatened to overwhelm me. The dogman's nostrils flared, drinking in my scent. Its head tilted to one side, almost curious, as it studied me. I realized I was still clutching my camera in a death grip. Slowly, carefully, I lowered it to hang by its strap around my neck. Any sudden movements felt like they might trigger an attack. Nice, doggy, I whispered, my voice trembling. It was a stupid thing to say, but my brain wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders at that moment. The creature's ears twitched at the sound of my voice. It took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. My heel caught on a root, and I stumbled, nearly falling. In that moment of imbalance, the Dogman moved. It was on me in an instant, faster than anything that size had any right to be. A massive paw-like hand wrapped around my upper arm, claws digging into my flesh through my jacket. I cried out in pain and terror, certain that this was the end, but instead of tearing me apart, the Dogman pulled me upright, steadying me on my feet. It leaned in close, its hot breath washing over my face as it sniffed at me intently. I squeezed my eyes shut, too terrified to look into that nightmarish visage any longer. Seconds stretched into an eternity. I waited for the pain, for the end, but it never came. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. The Dogman was still there, still gripping my arm, but it made no move to harm me further. Those intelligent eyes bored into mine, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was trying to communicate something. A low whine escaped its throat, almost plaintive. It released my arm and took a step back, then another. I remained rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what was happening. The creature glanced over its shoulder, back the way it had come, then looked at me again. It repeated the motion, more urgently this time. With a start, I realized it was trying to tell me something, warning me perhaps. But of what? A howl split the air, distant but clear even through the fog. The Dogman's ears flattened against its skull, and a growl rumbled in its chest. Without warning, it turned and loped off into the mist, quickly disappearing from view. I stood there for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and I sank to the ground, my whole body trembling. The encounter replayed in my mind on an endless loop, the terror, the certainty of death, and then, what? Mercy, understanding. I couldn't make sense of it. The distant howl came again, closer this time. Whatever the Dogman had been warning me about, it was getting nearer. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protest of my bruised arm. There would be time to examine the claw marks later. Right now, I needed to get the hell out of there. I turned and ran back down the trail, no longer caring about the summit or my planned route. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and whatever was coming as possible. The fog seemed to part before me, urged on by my desperation. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning as I fled through the misty forest. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking monster, every sound a pursuit, but nothing followed me, at least nothing I could see. When I finally burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot where I'd left my car, I was gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. My hands shook so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. I fumbled with the lock, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, certain that at any moment some horrific creature would emerge from the woods. But nothing came. I managed to get the door open and threw myself inside, locking it behind me. Only then, in the relative safety of my vehicle, did I allow myself to break down. Sobs racked my body as the full weight of what I'd experienced hit me. I sat there for a long time, alternating between crying and staring blankly at the foggy forest. My mind kept returning to those intelligent eyes, that moment of connection, understanding. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but I knew deep in my bones that I'd experienced something profound, something that defied explanation. As my breathing finally steadied and my hands stopped shaking, I realized I still had my camera. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and scrolled through the photos I'd taken that day. Misty landscapes, gnarled trees, nothing out of the ordinary, until the last photo. There, barely visible through the fog, was a dark, hulking shape. It was blurry, indistinct, but unmistakably the figure I'd first seen in the distance. Proof, not conclusive, perhaps, but proof nonetheless. I stared at the photo for a long time, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? The claw marks on my arm and this blurry photo were hardly concrete evidence, and part of me, a part I didn't fully understand, wanted to keep this encounter to myself, to protect not just my own sanity, but also the creature that had shown me mercy. As I finally started my car and began the drive home, I knew one thing for certain. I would never look at the wilderness the same way again. The forests held secrets, ancient and profound, and sometimes, if we're lucky or unlucky, we get a glimpse of those secrets, a peek behind the veil of what we think we know about the world. I may return to those woods someday, but not alone, and never without remembering the day I came face to face with a legend, the day I learned that the line between myth and reality is far blurrier than we'd like to believe. Story 3. It was supposed to be an adventure. Ben and I had planned this trip for months, a winter hike up into the mountains, just the two of us, away from everything, away from work, away from people, away from the noise of the city. The trail we picked wasn't exactly well known, and that's what made it perfect. Snow-covered, quiet, isolated. It was supposed to be peaceful, but peaceful turned into something else entirely. It was the second morning when we found the footprints. I remember waking up to the silence, the kind that only comes with fresh snow. It muffles everything, turns the world into this quiet, frozen landscape where even your breath feels loud. Ben was already outside the tent, messing with the stove, trying to get some coffee going. "Come on, man, get out here," he called. "You've got to see this." I groaned, still half asleep, and unzipped the tent, poking my head out. The cold hit me immediately, biting through the layers I'd slept in. But it wasn't the cold that caught my attention. It was Ben, standing there, staring down at something in the snow with this weird look on his face. "What?" I asked, stepping out and pulling my jacket tighter around me. "What's up?" He pointed down at the snow, and when I looked, I saw them. Footprints, but not just any footprints. These were massive, easily twice the size of mine, maybe bigger. And they weren't shaped like anything I'd ever seen. No boot treads, no paw prints. They were kind of human, but the proportions were all wrong. Too wide, too long, with deep indentations where claws, or something like claws, might have been. "Jesus," I muttered, kneeling down to get a closer look. "What the hell could have made these?" Ben shook his head, still staring. "I don't know. A bear, maybe." I stood up and looked around. The tracks stretched out from the tree line, cutting right through our camp before disappearing into the woods on the other side. There was no sign of them before the trees, like whatever had made them had just stepped out of nowhere. "Bears don't leave tracks like this," I said. "And look," I gestured to the distance between the prints. "It'd have to be walking on two legs. No way a bear walks like that." Ben didn't respond right away. He just kept looking at the prints, as if trying to make sense of them. I didn't blame him. They didn't make any sense. The size of the thing, the way it moved, nothing about it fit. But whatever it was, it had walked right through our camp while we were asleep. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. We spent the rest of the morning trying to brush it off. Ben joked about it being Bigfoot or some other cryptid, but I could tell he wasn't really laughing. Neither was I. We both knew it wasn't an animal we could explain away easily. But we had a long hike ahead of us, and we weren't about to let some strange tracks scare us off. By midday, we'd packed up camp and were back on the trail, the footprints still nagging at the back of my mind. I kept glancing around, scanning the woods, looking for anything that might explain what we'd seen. But the forest was quiet. Just the crunch of snow beneath our boots and the occasional gust of wind rattling through the branches. As the day wore on, the silence became almost oppressive. The deeper we went into the forest, the more it felt like something was watching us. Every now and then, I'd catch Ben looking over his shoulder too. Neither of us said anything, but I could tell he felt it too. That weird, unsettling feeling that we weren't alone. It was late afternoon when we found the clearing. We hadn't planned on stopping, but something about the place made us pause. The trees opened up, revealing a wide expanse of snow, untouched and pure, and right in the middle of it, the footprints reappeared. This time, they didn't just pass through. They started at the edge of the clearing, circled around in a wide arc, and then stopped. They just stopped. No tracks leading away, no sign of where the thing that made them had gone. It was like it had just vanished into thin air. Ben cursed under his breath, staring at the empty space where the tracks ended. I could hear the unease creeping into his voice. "This isn't right," he said. "No kidding," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever it is, it's not normal." We stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks. Neither of us wanted to move, but standing still didn't feel any safer. There was something about that clearing, something about those prints that made my skin crawl. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Maybe we should head back," Ben suggested, breaking the silence. I nodded. For once, I wasn't going to argue. The idea of spending another night out here didn't sit right with me, not after this. We turned back the way we'd come, moving quickly, not even trying to hide our anxiety anymore. The trail felt different on the way back. The trees seemed closer, darker, and the wind had picked up, howling through the branches like a warning. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each step taking us further from the clearing, but not far enough from the feeling of being watched. By the time dusk started to settle in, we were still a few miles from where we'd camped the night before. The sky had turned a deep purple, and the temperature was dropping fast. We had no choice but to set up camp for the night. Neither of us said it out loud, but I could tell Ben was thinking the same thing I was. We didn't want to stay out here any longer than we had to. We pitched the tent quickly, working in silence, and huddled inside as soon as it was up. The wind outside was relentless now, rattling the walls of the tent and making it impossible to relax. But it wasn't just the wind that kept me on edge. It was the silence that followed it. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I noticed Ben had gone still too, his eyes wide as he listened. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow just outside our tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I strained to hear. The steps circled the tent, just like the tracks in the clearing, moving with an eerie, unnatural precision. They stopped for a moment, right by my side of the tent, and I could hear something breathing. Deep, heavy breaths, too low and guttural to be human. I felt frozen, paralyzed with fear, my mind racing through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't some person messing with us. This was something else, something that shouldn't be out here. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ben and I exchanged a look, both of us too scared to speak, too scared to move. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, bracing for whatever might happen next. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and somehow we both drifted off, too tired to keep our eyes open any longer. But sleep wasn't peaceful. I woke up multiple times that night, convinced I could hear something just outside, pacing through the snow, watching us. When morning finally came, I was relieved. The first light of dawn filtered through the tent, and for a moment I almost convinced myself it had all been a bad dream. But when we stepped outside, the snow told a different story. The footprints were everywhere, circling the tent, stopping at both entrances, as if something had been waiting for us to come out. The size of them, the shape of them, it was all the same. And they led off into the forest again, disappearing into the trees like they always did. Ben didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We both knew we weren't sticking around to find out what had made them. We packed up camp in record time and started back down the trail, moving as fast as we could without breaking into a run. The feeling of being watched never left, not for a second. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind sent my heart racing, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Even then, as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left those prints was still out there, watching us go, waiting for its next chance to appear. And I knew, without a doubt, that I'd never come back to this place again. Story 4. The stench hit me first, a sickening mix of decay and something else, something primal and wrong. As I stood at the mouth of the cave, my flashlight beam revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare, I knew I'd stumbled onto something far beyond the scope of my usual duties as a park ranger. The piles of bones, some human, some not, told a story I wasn't sure I wanted to read. My name's Mike Callahan, and I've been a ranger at Blackwood National Park for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional drug operation hidden deep in the woods. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that cave. It all started 3 weeks ago, when hikers began disappearing. At first, we thought it was just bad luck, inexperienced backpackers getting lost in the vast wilderness. But as the numbers grew and no traces were found, we knew something was wrong. The higher-ups called for an expanded search, and that's how I found myself combing through a remote section of the park that hadn't seen a human footprint in years. The cave entrance was barely visible, hidden behind a thick curtain of vines and brush. I might have missed it entirely, if not for the faint trail leading up to it, not a human trail, but a game trail, worn smooth by frequent use. Something big had been coming and going from this cave, and recently, as I pushed aside the vines and stepped into the cool darkness, my instincts screamed at me to turn back. But I had a job to do. People were missing, and if there was any chance they were in here, I had to look. The beam of my flashlight danced across the cave walls, revealing primitive paintings that made my blood run cold. Stick figures fleeing from a towering, monstrous shape. The shape was crude, but unmistakably predatory: long limbs, a hunched posture, and a head that seemed to be a twisted mix of human and animal features. I swallowed hard and pressed on, the bones crunching beneath my boots. The further I went, the more recent the remains appeared. Some still had scraps of clothing clinging to them. I recognized a tattered backpack, the same brand we'd found abandoned at one of the campsites where hikers had vanished. My hand shook as I reached for my radio. I needed backup, needed to report what I'd found. But as I keyed the mic, all I got was static. The thick rock walls of the cave must have been blocking the signal. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It echoed through the cave, growing louder, closer. My flashlight beam danced wildly as I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. There, in the darkness beyond my light's reach, 2 red eyes gleamed. They were massive, far too high off the ground to belong to any normal predator, and they were fixed directly on me. I'd like to say I stood my ground. That years of ranger training kicked in, and I faced the threat head-on, but that would be a lie. In that moment, faced with something my mind couldn't comprehend, I did what any sane person would do. I ran. I turned and sprinted back towards the cave entrance, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. The growl behind me turned into a roar, a sound so primal and full of hunger that it sent ice through my veins. Heavy footfalls echoed through the cave, gaining on me with terrifying speed. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, faster. The cave entrance loomed ahead, a patch of dim daylight that seemed impossibly far away. Something swiped at my back, claws tearing through my jacket and grazing skin. The pain spurred me on, giving me a final burst of speed. I burst out of the cave, tumbling down the slope in a tangle of limbs and equipment. My flashlight went flying, disappearing into the underbrush. I scrambled to my feet, ready to keep running, but the attack I expected never came. Panting heavily, I turned to face the cave entrance. Nothing emerged. No monster, no glowing red eyes, just the silent vine-covered opening that gave no hint of the horrors within. For a long moment, I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it all? A trick of the light, maybe, combined with the stress of the past few weeks. But the pain in my back and the tatters of my jacket told a different story. Whatever I'd seen in that cave, it was real, and it was still in there. With shaking hands, I pulled out my radio again. This time, free of the cave's interference, it crackled to life. "This is Ranger Callahan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need immediate backup at my location. Multiple casualties found, possible predator situation. Approach with extreme caution." As I rattled off my coordinates, my mind raced. How was I going to explain this? Who would believe me? I'd seen the bones, sure, but the creature, they'd think I was crazy. Hell, I wasn't entirely sure I wasn't. It took almost an hour for backup to arrive. An hour I spent with my eyes glued to that cave entrance, my hand on my sidearm, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. By the time I heard the rumble of approaching vehicles, I was a nervous wreck. I met the team at the base of the hill, waving them down before they could get too close to the cave. Among them was my supervisor, Ranger Sarah Hawkins, her face etched with concern. "Mike, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Not a ghost, Sarah. Something worse. There's something in that cave. Something big, dangerous. It's been taking hikers." I could see the skepticism in her eyes, but to her credit, she didn't dismiss me outright. "Okay, start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what you saw." So I did. I told her about the bones, the cave paintings, the glowing eyes in the darkness. With each detail, her expression grew more serious. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "We'll approach this by the book. No one goes into that cave alone. We'll get forensics out here to process the remains, and we'll set up camera traps at the entrance. If something's coming and going, we'll catch it on film." I nodded, relief washing over me. She believed me, or at least she was taking me seriously enough to investigate. "What about the hikers? If there's any chance they're still alive?" Sarah's face hardened. "We'll do sweeps of the surrounding area. But Mike, given what you've described, I think we need to prepare ourselves for the worst." The next few days were a blur of activity. The cave became the center of a massive investigation. Forensics teams worked around the clock, cataloging the remains and collecting evidence. Camera traps were set up at the cave entrance and throughout the surrounding forest. Search parties combed every inch of the area, looking for any sign of survivors or additional caves. But the creature, whatever it was, didn't show itself again. The camera traps caught nothing but ordinary wildlife. No trace of the missing hikers was found, alive or dead, beyond the remains in the cave. As the days stretched into weeks, I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Or had the stress and the gruesome discovery in the cave caused me to hallucinate? It was a month after my encounter that Sarah called me into her office. Her face was grim as she gestured for me to sit down. "We're closing the investigation," she said without preamble. "The official report will list the cause of death for the hikers as animal attack, possibly a bear." I stared at her in disbelief. "A bear? Sarah, you know that's not what happened. You saw the bones, the cave paintings. This was something else." She held up a hand to stop me. "I know, Mike. I believe you. But we have no evidence to support anything beyond a mundane explanation. No prints, no DNA, no sightings, just your testimony and a bunch of inconclusive evidence. So we're just going to pretend it never happened, that there isn't something out there picking off hikers." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "We're increasing patrols in the area, installing more emergency beacons on the trails, putting out warnings about traveling in groups. It's the best we can do, without hard evidence." I wanted to argue further, but I knew it was pointless. Without proof, my story was just that, a story. One that would likely end my career if I pushed it too hard. As I left Sarah's office, I made a decision. Official investigation or not, I wasn't going to let this go. Whatever was in that cave was still out there, and next time, I'd be ready for it. I've been spending my off days in the woods near that cave, watching, waiting. I've set up my own camera traps, gathered my own evidence. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that growl again, echoing through the trees. A reminder that the forests hold secrets darker and more ancient than we can imagine. I don't know if I'll ever find the proof I need, but I do know this. I'll never look at these woods the same way again, and neither should anyone else who ventures into them, because something is out there watching and waiting, and sooner or later, it'll get hungry again. Story 5. It started with a whisper. I was hiking alone in the mountains, a long-awaited solo trip to clear my head. I'd been working non-stop for months, and the quiet of the wilderness was exactly what I needed. Just me, my pack, and the trail ahead. There was something freeing about the isolation, about the idea that for a few days no one would know where I was or what I was doing. It was just me and nature, the way I liked it. By the third day, I had already settled into a routine. Wake up at sunrise, eat, break camp, and hit the trail. I wasn't following any established route, just wandering deeper into the woods, exploring the less traveled paths. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that city life could never offer. Then, that night, I heard it for the first time. I was sitting by the fire, the stars bright overhead, my tent set up a few feet away. The air was cold, biting, but the fire kept me warm. As I stared into the flames, my mind wandering, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper carried on the wind. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. The wind could play tricks on you out here. The trees creaked, the leaves rustled, and sometimes it could sound like voices. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was my name. I froze, staring into the fire, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. It had been so faint that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily silent, save for the crackle of the fire. But I knew what I'd heard. Someone, something, had whispered my name. I stood up slowly, shining my flashlight around the campsite. Nothing, just the trees and the underbrush, the same as before. No sign of anyone or anything nearby. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid as the word left my mouth. My voice echoed slightly, then faded into the silence. Nothing. No response. I sat back down, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my gut. It had to be in my head. After all, I hadn't seen a single person in days. This area was remote, and there was no way anyone else would be out here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods seemed darker, the shadows longer, and the silence was too complete, as if the forest was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself that I was just overreacting, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. Eventually, I forced myself into the tent, zipped it up tight, and laid down, listening to the crackling of the dying fire outside. Sleep came, though it was restless, plagued with strange dreams I couldn't remember when I woke. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and for a moment I laughed at myself for letting my imagination run wild. I packed up camp and set off again, determined to push deeper into the mountains and leave the weirdness behind. But the whispering didn't stop. By midday, I'd found a new trail, less worn and clearly not used much. That was what I wanted, uncharted territory, away from the main paths. But as I hiked, I started hearing the whispers again, faint at first like the night before, but this time they followed me. Every few minutes, I'd catch it, my name, carried on the breeze. Sometimes it was soft, almost melodic, and other times it was harsh, like someone hissing it through clenched teeth. It came from different directions, always far away, just on the edge of hearing, as if whatever was speaking was keeping its distance, teasing me with its presence. I stopped several times, listening carefully, but the moment I stilled, the whispering would stop too. When I started walking again, it returned. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was birds, or the rustle of leaves creating the illusion of sound. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched, like eyes were following me from the trees, from the shadows, where the sunlight didn't quite reach. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The constant whispering had worn me down, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the sound of my own name being spoken in that unnatural way gnawed at me. I found a small clearing and set up camp, deciding to cut my hike short. I'd had enough. As the sun set, the forest around me seemed to grow darker faster than usual, the shadows creeping in like a thick fog. I lit a fire again, hoping it would chase away whatever was out there, though I wasn't sure if it would. The whispering had stopped for the moment, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it started again. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite control. And then, as if on cue, the whispering returned. This time it was louder. My name, clear as day, but still distant, still coming from somewhere just out of reach. The fire crackled in front of me, but the warmth it provided did nothing to ease the chill creeping into my bones. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and slowly turned in a circle, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something, no, someone, was standing just beyond the tree line. A tall, thin figure, barely visible in the fading light, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled back, tripping over a log, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I pointed it toward where I'd seen it. Gone. The figure was gone. I was breathing hard, my chest tight with panic. I blinked, trying to steady myself, to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't have been real. I had to be seeing things, right? But the whispering, it had been real. And that figure, I backed up toward the fire, keeping my flashlight trained on the edge of the clearing, expecting to see something step out of the shadows at any moment. But the forest remained still, silent. I thought about grabbing my pack, abandoning the camp and hiking back out in the dark. But the thought of walking through those woods at night with whatever that thing was out there froze me in place. I wasn't sure which was worse, staying here and waiting or walking into the unknown. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I retreated into the tent, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, my ears straining for any sound. The whispering had stopped again, but I knew it was still out there, watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep. Not really. Every sound outside, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. Hours passed in a blur of half-sleep and fear, until finally the first light of dawn started filtering through the tent. I crawled out of the tent, my body aching from the tension of the night. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest around me was quiet, peaceful even, but I didn't trust it. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, barely taking the time to eat, and started back down the trail. I was done. I didn't care about finishing the hike anymore. All I wanted was to get out of there, to get as far away from whatever had been stalking me as possible. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The sun was up, and for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself that it was over, that whatever had been happening had just been in my head. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I heard it again, my name. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Slowly I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the trees, and then I saw it again, the figure, tall, thin and hunched, standing just a few yards away, its glowing eyes locked on mine. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough, the way it moved, the way it tilted its head as if studying me. It wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat as it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The whispering started again, louder now, surrounding me from all sides, even though the figure never opened its mouth. My name repeated over and over like a chant. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, my boots slipping in the snow as I bolted down the trail, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was inside my head. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw my pack in the back, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut. my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. As I sped down the mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me leave, but it was gone. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. Whatever was out there, whatever had whispered my name, it wasn't finished with me. It had let me go this time, but deep down, I knew the truth. It was still waiting. Story 6. I never believed in monsters until I caught one on camera. Now, as I sit in this dark cabin with something massive prowling outside, I'm praying that disbelief was right all along. My name is Alex Chen, and I'm a wildlife photographer. For the past decade, I've trekked through some of the most remote wilderness areas on the planet, capturing images of creatures most people only dream of seeing. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Pacific Northwest. It all started 3 days ago when I set out to document the elusive mountain lion population in a particularly remote stretch of forest. The area had been the subject of local legends for years, tales of strange howls in the night and hikers gone missing. But I'd heard similar stories in a dozen other places, and they always turned out to be nothing more than campfire tales blown out of proportion. I hiked deep into the backcountry, well off any marked trails. The forest here was old growth, massive trees stretching up into a canopy so thick it turned midday into twilight. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. As night fell, I set up camp in a small clearing. After a meal of freeze-dried stroganoff, the glamorous life of a nature photographer, I set about placing my trail cameras. These high-tech devices were motion-activated and equipped with night vision. If any large predators passed by in the night, I'd have crystal-clear footage come morning. I placed the last camera about 100 yards from my tent, angling it towards a game trail that showed signs of recent use. Satisfied with my setup, I turned in for the night, excited at the prospect of what images morning might bring. The sound of rain on canvas woke me just before dawn. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, listening to the gentle patter and enjoying the cocoon-like warmth, but excitement soon got the better of me, and I forced myself out into the chilly morning air to check my cameras. The first 2 showed nothing out of the ordinary. A few deer, a raccoon, nothing to write home about. But as I approached the 3rd camera, the one by the game trail, I felt a prickle of unease. The underbrush around the trail was trampled, far more extensively than it had been the night before. Whatever had come through here was big. With trembling fingers, I removed the memory card and slotted it into my tablet. The first few images were what I expected. More deer, an owl swooping low over the trail. And then, at around 2 a.m., everything changed. The creature that filled the frame was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in thick dark fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I could identify. It walked upright, on 2 legs, with a gait that was unnervingly human-like. Its arms were long, ending in hands that looked capable of crushing bone. But it was the face that sent ice through my veins. Turned towards the camera, alerted perhaps by the faint click of the shutter, was a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of ape and man. The brow was heavy, the nose flat and wide, but the eyes were disturbingly intelligent. They stared directly into the camera lens, filled with the awareness that no mere animal should possess. I stared at the image for a long time, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was it. The proof cryptozoologists had been searching for decades, definitive evidence of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it. My hand shook as I flipped through the rest of the images. There were several more, showing the creature moving down the trail before it vanished back into the forest. I should have been ecstatic. This was the kind of discovery that would make my career, that would rewrite our understanding of the natural world. But as I stood there, in that silent forest, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept over me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The weight of the creature's gaze, even just captured in a photograph, seemed to press down on me. I hastily packed up my camp, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. I kept expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the shadows, those two intelligent eyes fixed on me. But nothing appeared. The forest remained still and silent as I shouldered my pack and began the long hike back to civilization. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the small cabin I'd rented as a base camp. Exhausted and still shaken, I collapsed onto the bed, my tablet clutched to my chest like a shield. I should call someone, I thought. A university, a newspaper, anyone who might believe me. But as I reached for my satellite phone, doubt began to creep in. Would anyone actually believe me? The photo was clear, yes, but in an age of digital manipulation, would it be enough? And if they did believe me, what then? This creature, if it was real, had managed to stay hidden for centuries. Did I have the right to expose its existence to the world? As these thoughts tumbled through my mind, darkness fell outside the cabin windows. I got up to fix myself a meager dinner, more out of habit than hunger. That's when I heard it, a soft thud from the porch outside, like something heavy settling its weight on old wood. I froze, a can of beans halfway to the small stove. For a long moment there was only silence. Then, unmistakably, the sound of breathing. Deep and heavy breaths, far too big to belong to any normal forest creature. My heart pounding in my chest, I crept to the window. The porch was shrouded in darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out a shape. A massive, fur-covered silhouette, hunched down as if to peer through the glass. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from the window. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. And yet, the heavy breathing continued, now accompanied by a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl. With trembling hands, I grabbed my satellite phone. But who could I call? The local sheriff. Even if they believed me, they were hours away. By the time help arrived, I couldn't finish the thought. Instead, I retreated to the small bedroom, closing and locking the door behind me. Not that a flimsy interior door would do much against a creature that size, but it made me feel marginally safer. Hours passed, though they felt like years. The creature outside moved occasionally, heavy footsteps creaking on the porch boards. Once, I heard a snuffling sound at the bedroom window, as if it was trying to catch my scent. I huddled in the far corner, barely daring to breathe. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the window, the noises outside finally ceased. I waited another hour, straining my ears for any sound, before I finally worked up the courage to emerge from the bedroom. The porch was empty when I finally peered outside, but the evidence of my night visitor was unmistakable. Deep footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. Long, coarse hairs caught on the rough wood of the porch railing. And there, gouged deep into one of the support posts, were 3 parallel claw marks, each as long as my forearm. I sank to my knees, my mind reeling. This was real, all of it was real, and somehow, impossibly, I had survived the night. With shaking hands, I pulled out my tablet and pulled up the photos from the trail camera. I stared at that face, those eyes, trying to understand. Why had it come here? Why hadn't it attacked? Was it merely curious? Or was there some deeper intelligence at work? Some purpose I couldn't fathom? I don't have answers to those questions, even now. But I do know this. The world is bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than we can imagine. There are things out there, creatures that defy explanation, that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. I still have the photos, locked away in a safe deposit box. I haven't shown them to anyone, haven't breathed a word of what happened to another soul until now. Maybe someday I'll be ready to share my discovery with the world. But for now, I'm content to keep this secret, to be a guardian of sorts for a creature that the modern world isn't ready to accept. Because out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, something is watching. Something that walks on 2 legs, that thinks, that perhaps even understands more than we give it credit for. And until we're ready to face that reality, perhaps it's better that it remains hidden, a mystery glimpsed only by those brave or foolish enough to venture into the unknown. As for me, I'll keep taking my cameras into the wild places of the world. But now, when I hear a twig snap in the darkness, or feel eyes upon me in the depths of the forest, I'll know that not all monsters are mere myth. Some of them are real, and they're closer than we ever dared to imagine. Story 7. There was something wrong with that cabin. I knew it the moment I stepped through the door. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp wood, and something else, something sour and metallic that made my stomach churn. I'd been called out to investigate strange noises coming from an old, abandoned place deep in the park, a few miles off the main trail. Normally, it was teenagers looking for a thrill, breaking into these old structures for a place to drink or scare each other with ghost stories, but this was different. When I first saw the cabin, it had looked like it had been swallowed by the forest. Vines crawled up its sides, the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and the trees around it had grown so dense that barely any sunlight reached the clearing. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, half open, like an invitation I didn't want to accept, but I'd been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes it was the places that made you uneasy that needed the most attention. So I took a deep breath, gripped my flashlight tighter, and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was overwhelming, a mix of rot and rust, and something else I couldn't quite place. The kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and makes you want to gag. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. The cabin was small, just a single room with a few broken-down pieces of furniture, a crumbling fireplace, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. No signs of teenagers, no beer bottles or graffiti, just decay. But then I saw the chains. They were bolted to the wall, heavy and rusted, with broken links hanging loose, the kind you'd use to restrain something big. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the work of kids messing around. Someone had been keeping something in here, something strong enough to break free. I moved closer, shining my light on the wall where deep, jagged scratches had been carved into the wood. They were wide, like claw marks, as if whatever had been chained here had tried, desperately, to get out. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't the work of any animal I'd ever seen. I didn't want to be here any longer than I had to, but I couldn't leave without making a full report. I turned to head outside, but just as I reached the door, I heard it. A low growl, deep and rumbling, coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio at my side. The growl wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the guttural snarl of a bear or the sharp bark of a coyote. It was low, almost vibrating, like the sound was coming from something much bigger, something angry. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I lifted the radio to my mouth. "This is Ranger McCall," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the old cabin near Hollow Creek." Before I could finish, the radio crackled with static, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a growl, but not like the one I'd heard before. This one was distorted, twisted, and layered with something else, like the sound was coming from deep underwater. And then, through the static, I heard my own voice. "Ranger McCall, Ranger McCall." The voice on the other end mimicked my words, warped and broken, as if something was mocking me. I stared at the radio in disbelief, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, the growl came again, louder this time, closer. I backed up toward the door, my flashlight beam flickering as I scanned the tree line. My gut screamed at me to run, but my feet stayed rooted in place. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Whatever was out there was watching me, just beyond the edge of the light, hidden in the shadows of the trees. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step out of the cabin, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The air had gone deathly still, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots as I moved. The wind had stopped, and even the birds were silent. The forest, usually alive with noise, felt like it was holding its breath. I had to get back to the station, had to call this in properly, but the trail back was long, and the thought of walking it alone, knowing that something was out there, made my skin crawl. Still, staying here wasn't an option. Whatever had been chained in that cabin wasn't human, and it was still nearby. I started walking, trying to keep my pace steady, my breath calm. Every few steps, I'd glance behind me, expecting to see something massive barreling through the trees after me, but the forest remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and they were keeping pace with me. My heart leaped into my throat. I stopped in my tracks, listening, my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped, too. I shined my flashlight into the woods, the beam bouncing off the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no eyes reflecting the light, but I knew it was there. I started moving again, faster this time, and the footsteps followed, matching my speed. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. I had to get to the ranger station. I had to get out of these woods. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I heard the growl again. This time, it was so close that I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. I broke into a run, my boots slipping on the damp leaves as I sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at my face. The sound of something crashing through the underbrush behind me sent a wave of panic surging through my veins. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trees flew past in a blur, the trail narrowing as I pushed myself harder, faster. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't slow down. The station wasn't far now. I could see the faint glow of the lights through the trees, just a little farther. The growl erupted again, and I felt the ground shake beneath me as something huge moved in the woods to my right. My flashlight beam flickered, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of something. A massive, hulking shape moving through the trees, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was fast, faster than anything that size should be. I stumbled, my heart slamming against my ribs as I forced myself to keep running. The station was so close, just a few more yards. I could hear the creature behind me now, its heavy breathing, the sound of its claws tearing through the underbrush. I reached the door of the station, threw it open, and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, my entire body shaking. The station was small, just a single room with a desk and a few supplies, but it felt like a fortress compared to the open woods. For a long time I just sat there, listening, waiting for the creature to come crashing through the door. But the only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Slowly, I got to my feet and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was still, the clearing in front of the station empty. No movement, no glowing eyes, but I knew it was out there. I grabbed the radio off the desk, my fingers shaking as I tried to raise the main office. "This is Ranger McCall," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need backup. Now." There was a long pause, and then the radio crackled with static. "Ranger McCall. Ranger McCall." The voice came through, broken and distorted, mimicking my words in that same mocking tone. And then I heard the growl again. It was right outside the door. I dropped the radio, my heart racing as I backed away from the window. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear the sound of claws scratching against the wood of the door, the frame shaking as something massive pressed against it. I didn't have much time. I grabbed the emergency rifle from the cabinet and loaded it, my hands trembling as I aimed it at the door. The growling continued, the door shaking violently now as the creature outside slammed against it, trying to force its way in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, my finger hovering over the trigger, waiting for the next attack. But nothing came. Slowly, I moved to the window again and peered outside. The clearing was empty. The woods were still. Whatever had been out there was gone, for now. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the station, the rifle in my lap, waiting, listening. Every creak, every rustle outside sent a jolt of fear through me. By morning, the sun rose, casting long shadows across the clearing. The thing, whatever it had been, was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been chained in that cabin had broken free, and now it was out there. And it was hunting. Story 8. The legends always say you shouldn't speak its name, but we did. And now, as I lay here in this tent, listening to the whispers just outside, I know with terrifying certainty that we called it to us. My name is Jamie, and what was supposed to be a fun camping trip with friends has turned into a nightmare I'm not sure we'll survive. It all started 2 days ago, when our group of 5 decided to take advantage of the long weekend and head out to Blackwood Forest for some hiking and camping. We were an eclectic bunch. There was me, a librarian with a passion for folklore, Mike, a personal trainer with more muscles than sense, Lisa, a nurse who'd seen it all, or so she thought, Tara, an artist always looking for inspiration in nature, and Derek, a tech guy who'd rather be anywhere with decent Wi-Fi. The first day was perfect. We hiked deep into the forest, well off the marked trails. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as we made our way through stands of ancient trees. As the sun began to set, we found a small clearing near a babbling brook, the perfect spot to set up camp. After pitching our tents and getting a fire going, we settled in for dinner. That's when the trouble started. Mike, always the one to liven things up, suggested we tell scary stories. It's tradition, he insisted, pulling out a flask of whiskey to pass around. We all groaned but agreed. It was all harmless fun, right? Tara went first with a classic ghost story. Derek followed with an alien abduction tale that had us rolling our eyes. Then it was my turn. I should have known better. As a folklore enthusiast, I knew the power of stories, of names spoken aloud. But the whiskey had loosened my tongue, and I found myself recounting the legend of the Wendigo. In Algonquin folklore, I began, my voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. The Wendigo is a malevolent spirit, born of hunger and desperation. It possesses humans, driving them to cannibalism. Once transformed, the Wendigo is forever cursed with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. I described its appearance, gaunt and skeletal, with ash-grey skin stretched tight over bone, its eyes sunken and glowing with an otherworldly hunger, antlers sprouting from its skull, tangled with bits of hair from its victims. They say, I continued, caught up in the storytelling, that to speak its name is to invite its presence, that even thinking too hard about the Wendigo can draw its attention. As I finished, a hush fell over our group. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. For a moment, the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Then Mike broke the silence with a laugh. Nice one, Jamie. Real creepy. But it'll take more than some made-up monster to scare me. The others chuckled nervously, the tension broken. We moved on to lighter topics, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. As we turned in for the night, I found myself straining to hear any unusual sounds in the forest around us. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake in the pre-dawn darkness. Something had woken me, but I couldn't place what. Then I heard it again, a scream. High and thin, it echoed through the trees, sending ice through my veins. I scrambled out of my tent, nearly colliding with Lisa, who had also heard the sound. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, the scream came again, closer this time. It started human but twisted into something else, something that made my skin crawl. The others emerged from their tents, looking disheveled and confused. "Probably just a mountain lion," Mike said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We huddled around the remnants of our fire, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. As the sky began to lighten, we tried to convince ourselves it had been nothing, just an animal, or maybe the wind playing tricks on us. But as the day wore on, Strange things kept happening. We found Derek's backpack shredded, the contents strewn across our campsite. Claw marks scored the trees around our clearing, too high up to have been made by any normal animal. And always, just at the edge of hearing, we could make out whispers, words almost but not quite intelligible, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By unspoken agreement, we decided to cut our trip short. We hastily packed up camp and started the long hike back to civilization, but nothing was familiar. Trails we had easily followed on the way in now seemed to twist and turn, leading us in circles. The trees pressed in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers trying to hold us back. As darkness fell, we realized with growing horror that we were lost. The forest had changed, become something alien and menacing. We had no choice but to make camp again, this time huddling close together in a small clearing that offered little protection. No one suggested telling stories that night. We sat in tense silence, jumping at every sound. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers just outside our tent. At first, I thought it was one of the others, maybe Lisa or Tara talking in their sleep. But as I listened, I realized with growing horror that the voice was coming from outside. "Jamie," it whispered, my name drawn out into a sibilant hiss. "Jamie, we know you're awake. We can smell your fear." I lay there, paralyzed, as the whispers continued. They spoke of hunger, of flesh, of an appetite that could never be sated, and underneath it all was my own voice, an echo of the story I had told around the campfire. A clawed hand scraped against the tent fabric, and I had to bite back a scream. The others were still asleep, oblivious to the horror just inches away. I wanted to wake them, to run, to do anything but lie there waiting for the inevitable. But my body refused to obey, locked in place by a terror beyond anything I had ever known. The zipper of the tent began to move, slowly inching upward. A fetid odor seeped in, the stench of rotting meat and decay. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see what was about to come through that opening, but the attack I expected never came. Instead, I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of something large moving quickly away from the tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, ears straining for any sound of its return. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I finally found the courage to move. I shook the others awake, my voice trembling as I recounted what had happened in the night. To my surprise, they believed me without question. Each of them, it turned out, had experienced something similar. Derek had dreamed of being chased through an endless forest by something with glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth. Tara had woken to find strange symbols carved into the tree next to her tent. Mike, for all his bravado, admitted to hearing his name called out in the darkness in a voice that sounded like his long-dead father. As we broke camp for what we hoped would be the last time, the feeling of being watched was constant. Eyes seemed to peer at us from every shadow, and more than once I caught glimpses of a tall, skeletal figure moving just at the edge of my vision. We walked for hours, the forest growing denser and darker with each step. The whispers were constant now, a susurration of hungry voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It was Lisa who finally spotted the trail marker, half hidden behind a gnarled oak. We ran towards it, hope giving us a final burst of energy. As we burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot where we had left our cars, the sense of relief was palpable. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That by speaking its name, by giving voice to the legend, we had awakened something ancient and hungry, something that wouldn't simply go back to sleep. I'm home now, safe in my apartment with its locks and alarms and comforting electric lights. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear those whispers, and I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that the Wendigo is still out there, waiting, hungry, and I can't help but wonder, who will be next to speak its name? Story 9. I'll never forget the way the camp looked when we found it. The tent was still standing, the fire pit cold but intact, and the backpack resting by a tree like someone had just stepped away for a moment. But there was no one there, no footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle, just nothing. It was like the guy had simply vanished into thin air. We'd been searching for Tim Hartley, a hiker who had gone missing 2 days earlier. He was an experienced outdoorsman, not the kind of guy who would just wander off and get lost. His friends said he'd set up camp here, but when they came back the next morning, he was gone. That's when they called us in, the park rangers. A search party was organized, but after 2 days of searching the area, we had found nothing, until now. And even now, standing in the middle of his empty camp, nothing about this felt right. The first thing that struck me was the silence. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves, was unnaturally still. It was the kind of silence that wraps around you, making every breath sound too loud, every heartbeat echo in your ears. It wasn't right. "Hey, you seeing this?" my partner, Jake, asked, crouching down near the fire pit. "Yeah," I muttered, shining my flashlight around the perimeter of the camp, even though it was still early evening and the sun hadn't fully set yet. "It's weird. Everything's just here." Jake stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. No sign of him at all, no tracks leading out, nothing. I didn't respond, but I felt the same unease gnawing at my insides. It was like the forest itself had swallowed him whole. I'd been a ranger for years, and I'd seen people get lost, get hurt, even get attacked by wildlife. But this was different. There was no sign of anything. No blood, no torn clothes, no broken branches, just the eerie, undisturbed camp. Jake and I split up to check the surrounding area, each of us moving slowly, carefully. I kept my eyes on the ground, searching for any trace of movement, but the forest floor was untouched, blanketed in a thick layer of pine needles and moss. No sign that anyone or anything had passed through here recently. I was about to head back to camp when I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a rhythm to it. A slow, deliberate rustling, like something moving through the underbrush, just beyond the tree line. "Jake!" I called out, my voice low. There was no answer. I turned, scanning the trees with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The rustling stopped as soon as I spoke, leaving only that oppressive silence in its wake. I felt my stomach tighten with a mix of nerves and dread. Maybe I was just on edge from the weirdness of the situation, but something about the forest didn't feel right. It felt wrong, too quiet, too still, like it was waiting for something. I headed back to camp, where Jake was standing with his hands on his hips, staring out into the woods with a frown on his face. "Did you hear that?" I asked, approaching him. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkening trees. "Yeah, something's out there." The unease I'd felt earlier tightened into a knot of fear. We were both seasoned rangers. We knew the woods, knew the sounds animals made when they moved through the brush. This wasn't that. This was different. We stood there for a few more minutes, listening, waiting, but nothing happened. The rustling didn't come back. The forest stayed silent, almost unnervingly so. "Let's head back," Jake said finally, shaking his head. "We'll call it in and get some more guys out here tomorrow." I nodded in agreement, but as we started walking back toward the trail, something caught my eye. Just off to the right, in the shadow of a large tree, there was a dark shape, something small, something out of place. I shone my flashlight on it and froze. It was Tim's boot. It was sitting there, perfectly upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there, but there was no sign of him. No other gear, no tracks, nothing. "Jake," I said slowly, pointing. He turned and saw it too, his face going pale. We approached the boot cautiously, both of us on high alert now. I bent down and picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't torn or damaged. No blood, no sign of a struggle. It was just there. But then I saw something else. A few feet away, hidden in the shadows, was another boot. And next to that, Tim's jacket crumpled on the ground. Jake and I exchanged a look, the unease in the air thickening into something worse, something like fear. "Where the hell is he?" Jake muttered, his voice low and tense. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that none of this made any sense. We decided to radio it in, let the search team know what we'd found. But as Jake reached for his radio, a sound stopped us cold. It was a low, guttural growl, deep, primal, and far too close. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The growl came again, this time from a different direction, and then another, and another, like multiple things, were circling us, moving through the trees just beyond the edge of our light. My heart raced, my skin prickling with the overwhelming sense that we were being hunted. "Jake, we need to move," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. He nodded, his hand on his sidearm, and we started backing up slowly, our flashlights sweeping the darkening forest. The growls continued, deep and rumbling, always moving, always shifting, but never coming closer. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet again. No growls, no rustling, just the same eerie silence as before. I held my breath, listening, waiting for something, anything to happen, but there was nothing. The forest had gone still. "Let's go," Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. We turned and started walking quickly back toward the trail, not daring to look behind us. My heart was pounding in my chest, my pulse deafening in my ears. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground ahead, my entire body on high alert. We made it back to the trail without incident, and for a brief moment I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps behind us. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and turned. At first I saw nothing, just the trees and the fading light of dusk. But then, out of the shadows, something moved. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly fast. It darted between the trees, too quick for me to get a good look, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. Jake grabbed my arm. "Run!" he hissed. And we did. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life, our boots pounding the earth, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. All we could do was run, our bodies fueled by pure, animalistic fear. By the time we reached the ranger station, my legs were shaking, my lungs burning. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it, both of us gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. For a long time, we just stood there, staring at each other, waiting for the thing that had chased us to break through the door. But it never did. Outside, the night was quiet. Peaceful, the kind of peace that didn't make any sense after what we'd just experienced. Jake and I never found Tim Hartley. A few more search parties went out over the next week, but all they found was the same thing we had, an empty camp, a few scattered belongings, and no trace of the man who had vanished. Whatever had taken him was still out there, in those woods, and I wasn't about to go looking for it again. Story 10. The wind howled, snow stinging my face as I stumbled through the whiteout. I'd been skiing these slopes for years, but now, lost and alone, I realized how quickly nature could turn deadly. As I huddled in the cave for shelter, I had no idea that the real danger was lurking in the darkness behind me. My name is Emma Larson, and I've been a backcountry skier for most of my adult life. There's nothing quite like the rush of carving fresh tracks through untouched powder, far from the crowded resort runs. But on that fateful day in the Cascade Mountains, my experience and skill meant nothing in the face of nature's fury, and something far more terrifying. The day had started perfectly. Clear blue skies stretched overhead as I made my way up the mountain, my skins gripping the snow with each step. I'd checked the weather report before setting out. A small storm system was expected to move in later that afternoon, but I planned to be well on my way down by then. As I reached the summit, I paused to take in the view. Snow-capped peaks stretched as far as the eye could see, the valleys between them filled with mist. I smiled. savoring the moment of solitude and beauty before beginning my descent. The first few runs were exhilarating. The snow was perfect, light, fluffy powder that sprayed up around me with each turn. I lost myself in the rhythm of the skiing, the world narrowing down to just me, my skis, and the mountain. It wasn't until my third run that I noticed the change in the weather. The wind had picked up, driving clouds across the sky at an alarming rate. I frowned, checking my watch. The storm wasn't supposed to hit for hours yet. I decided to make one last run before heading back to my car. That was my first mistake. Halfway down the slope, the storm hit with a ferocity that took my breath away. One moment I could see the trees lining the run. The next, I was engulfed in a world of white. The wind roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. Snow pelted me from all directions, so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. I tried to continue down, hoping to find shelter in the trees, but it was hopeless. I couldn't tell which way was down anymore, let alone where the safest route might be. After narrowly avoiding a collision with a half-buried boulder, I knew I had to stop. Panic began to set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was alone, in the middle of a whiteout, with no idea which direction would lead me to safety. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and despite my layers, I could feel the cold beginning to seep into my bones. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming out of the whiteness. As I got closer, I realized it was the entrance to a small cave, barely visible through the driving snow. Relief flooded through me. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter. I managed to get my skis off and stumbled into the cave, gasping as I escaped the full force of the wind. The silence was almost deafening after the roar of the storm. I fumbled for my headlamp, clicking it on to examine my surroundings. The cave was deeper than I'd initially thought, stretching back into darkness beyond the reach of my light. The floor was surprisingly clear of debris, almost smooth in places. Strange markings covered the walls, not petroglyphs or anything man-made, but long, parallel grooves that looked disturbingly like claw marks. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this place felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was safe from the storm, and that was what mattered. I set about making myself as comfortable as possible, laying out my emergency blanket and digging some energy bars from my pack. As I huddled there, listening to the howl of the wind outside, I tried to formulate a plan. I had enough supplies to last the night if necessary, but I hoped the storm would pass quickly. Once visibility improved, I could try to make my way down the mountain. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual dimming of my headlamp as the batteries began to drain. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting stronger, the wind's howl taking on an almost animal-like quality that set my nerves on edge. It was during one of these howls that I heard it, a sound from deeper within the cave. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But then I heard it again, a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I held my breath, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, unmistakably, the sound of breathing. Deep, heavy breaths that echoed off the cave walls. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. My headlamp, when I switched it on, seemed painfully dim. The beam trembled as my hand shook, illuminating bare rock and dancing shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the breathing grew louder, closer, and with it came a smell. A rank, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog and rotting meat. I backed up towards the cave entrance, my eyes darting frantically around the cavern. That's when I saw them, two pinpricks of light in the darkness. Too high off the ground to be a normal animal, they glowed with an eerie, greenish light, and as I watched, they blinked. A low growl rumbled through the cave, so deep I felt it in my bones. The eyes began to move forward, and with them came a shape. Massive and hunched, it was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. In the dim light, I could make out shaggy fur, muscled limbs that ended in wickedly curved claws, and a head that was a nightmarish blend of bear and wolf. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This creature shouldn't exist. It was impossible. And yet, here it was, advancing on me with a predatory grace that spoke of years of hunting in these mountains. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I bolted for the cave entrance. The storm outside suddenly seemed far less threatening than what lurked in the darkness behind me. I burst out into the whiteout, snow immediately blinding me. The wind cut through my layers like a knife, but I didn't care. I ran, stumbling through knee-deep snow, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. Behind me, I heard a roar that shook the very air. It was a sound of primal hunger, of a predator denied its prey. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature had emerged from the cave, its massive form silhouetted against the snow. It dropped to all fours and began to lope after me, covering ground at a terrifying speed. I don't know how long I ran, or in what direction. My world narrowed down to the burning in my lungs, the ache in my legs, and the bone-deep certainty that if I stopped, I would die. Somehow, miraculously, I stumbled onto a ski run. Through the driving snow, I could make out the shapes of chairlifts. I had made it back to the resort. Lights glowed in the distance, the base lodge. I wanted to cry with relief, but I didn't dare slow down. I could still hear the creature behind me, its growls carrying over the wind. I pushed myself harder, desperation giving me a final burst of speed. As I neared the lodge, I began to scream for help. Figures appeared, shouting questions I couldn't hear over the wind and my own frantic cries. Hands grabbed me, pulling me inside to warmth and safety. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. As concerned faces crowded around me, I tried to explain, to warn them about what was out there in the storm, but the words wouldn't come. I could only point back the way I had come, towards the darkness and the creature that lurked within it. They told me later that a search and rescue team went out, but found nothing, no tracks, no signs of any large predator. They chalked my experience up to hypothermia and fear, a hallucination brought on by my ordeal in the storm. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that growl again, a reminder that there are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation, things that hunt in the shadows, always hungry, always waiting for unwary prey to stumble into their domain. I still ski, but never alone, and never in the backcountry. Some risks aren't worth taking. Some predators are best left undisturbed in their snowy lairs, because out there, in the howling wind and blinding snow, something waits, something with glowing eyes and hunger that can never be satisfied. And I was lucky to escape it once. I doubt I'd be so fortunate a second time. Story 11. The warnings had been clear, but we didn't care. Locals in the tiny mountain town had told us not to go too deep into the woods. They mentioned stories of the Wendigo, some ancient creature, cursed to roam the wilderness, hungry for human flesh. It was folklore, nothing more than campfire tales meant to scare tourists like us. At least, that's what we thought. "Don't go beyond the river," the old man at the gas station had said, his voice serious and low. "That's Wendigo territory." We laughed it off, my friends and I. We weren't the type to believe in monsters. We were just a group of city kids looking for a weekend adventure, some camping, hiking, maybe a few beers around the fire, a way to escape the grind of everyday life. We should have listened. The first night was perfect. The 5 of us, me, Eric, Matt, Lisa, and Jenny, set up camp by a small creek, just a mile or so from where we'd parked the cars. The woods were thick, but the air was crisp, the stars bright overhead, and we felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves. We laughed, told ghost stories, drank a few beers, and eventually crawled into our tents, tired and content. But by the second night, things started to change. Eric was the first one to notice it. He'd woken up before dawn, unable to sleep, and had wandered a little ways from the camp to clear his head. When he came back, he looked shaken, his usual cocky grin replaced by a frown. "There's something wrong with the woods," he muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. The flames hissed and popped, casting long shadows across his face. "It's too quiet." Matt laughed, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's the middle of nowhere, dude. What do you expect?" "No, I mean it," Eric insisted, his voice low. "There's no birds, no bugs, not even the wind. It's like everything just stopped." I glanced around, realizing that he was right. The night before had been filled with the usual forest sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But now, as I listened, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. "Maybe it's just the weather," Lisa offered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's colder tonight." "Yeah, maybe," Eric muttered, but he didn't look convinced. We tried to brush it off, but there was something unsettling about the silence. As the night went on, the feeling of unease grew. The fire, which had felt warm and comforting the night before, now seemed small and weak, the darkness pressing in around us like a living thing. By midnight, the unease had settled deep into my bones. Every time I glanced into the shadows beyond the firelight, I thought I saw movement, something quick, just at the edge of my vision, but gone before I could focus on it. I wasn't the only one, either. Jenny kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale, and even Matt, who was usually the loudest of the group, had gone quiet. "We should call it a night," I suggested, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No one argued. We crawled into our tents, zipping them up tight, as if the thin nylon walls could keep whatever was out there away. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the sound of my own breathing, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A low, guttural moan, deep and slow, like it was coming from the earth itself. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, and followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the forest just beyond our camp. I held my breath, straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps circled the camp, slow and steady, as if whatever was out there was taking its time, stalking us. "Did you hear that?" Jenny's voice was a whisper from the tent next to mine. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence again. My skin prickled with dread. I could feel the presence of something in the darkness, just beyond the thin walls of the tent. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong in this world. Then, suddenly, Eric's tent unzipped. I heard him stumble out, his breathing ragged, his footsteps heavy as he moved toward the trees. "Eric!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Where are you going?" But he didn't respond. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I looked around, heart racing, and saw Eric's figure moving toward the tree line, his movements slow and jerky, like he was in a trance. "Eric!" I shouted, louder this time. "What are you doing?" He didn't turn around. He just kept walking, his back to us, disappearing into the shadows. Without thinking, I ran after him, calling his name, the others' voices echoing behind me as they scrambled to follow. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't seem to catch up. Eric was moving deeper into the forest, faster now, slipping between the trees like a shadow. Finally, I stopped, panting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees around me were thick, blocking out what little moonlight there was. I couldn't see Eric anymore. And then I heard the moan again, louder this time, closer. My blood turned to ice. It was followed by a sound I'll never forget, a wet, tearing noise, like flesh being ripped apart. And then the scream, Eric's scream. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, unable to process what I'd just heard. The others caught up to me, their faces pale with fear. "What the hell was that?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her face. "We need to go now." But before any of us could move, the trees around us seemed to come alive. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. A figure stepped out from the shadows. At first, I thought it was Eric, but then I saw its eyes, glowing white, hollow, empty. Its skin was grey, stretched tight over its bones, and its limbs were impossibly long, like they didn't belong to a human body. It stood there, just a few feet away, staring at us with those empty eyes, its mouth twisted into a grotesque, hungry grin. The Wendigo. None of us moved. None of us breathed. We were frozen in place, trapped by the creature's gaze, the cold of the night creeping into our bones. The Wendigo let out another low moan, its mouth opening wider, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and then it lunged. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the sensation of cold hands grabbing at me as I turned and ran. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The forest was a blur of shadows and twisted branches as we sprinted back toward camp, the sound of the creature's growls echoing behind us. When we finally reached the clearing, the fire had gone out, leaving the camp in darkness. We didn't stop. We grabbed whatever we could carry, our packs, our keys, and bolted for the cars. We didn't speak as we tore down the mountain road, the Wendigo's growl still ringing in my ears. The image of its empty eyes burned into my mind. We never found Eric. We didn't go back for him. Not after what we saw, whatever had taken him, whatever that creature was. It wasn't something we could fight. It was something ancient, something evil. And it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next group of idiots who thought they could ignore the warnings. I'll never forget the way the forest felt that night, like it was alive, like it was watching us, like it knew, and I'll never go back. Story 12. The tracks in the snow were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too big for a bear, too strange for anything I could name. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the full moon rose, I realized, with growing horror, that we weren't the hunters anymore. We were the prey. My name's Jack Hawkins, and I've been a hunter all my life. Growing up in rural Montana, I learned to track and shoot before I could drive. My buddy Steve and I had been planning this hunting trip for months, eager to bag a nice deer or elk to fill our freezers for the winter. We'd driven deep into the Bitterroot National Forest, well off the beaten path. The area was known for its abundant wildlife and challenging terrain, perfect for experienced hunters looking for a real adventure. As we set up our small camp in a clearing, the excitement was palpable. Tomorrow, we'd start tracking our quarry. The first day dawned clear and cold, a fresh layer of snow blanketing the ground, perfect tracking conditions. We set out at first light, our breath fogging in the crisp air as we moved silently through the trees. It was mid-morning when we first noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like bear prints, but something was off. They were huge, easily twice the size of any bear track I'd ever seen, and the shape was wrong, longer, with what looked like elongated toes ending in sharp claw marks. "What do you make of these, Steve?" I whispered, crouching down to examine the prints more closely. Steve frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Never seen anything like it, Jack. Mountain lion, maybe, but way too big." We debated for a few minutes, but curiosity got the better of us. Whatever had made these tracks, it had to be something impressive. We decided to follow them, our original hunt forgotten in the thrill of this new mystery. The tracks led us deeper into the forest, into areas I'd never explored before. The trees grew denser, older, their gnarled branches blocking out much of the weak winter sunlight. An eerie silence settled over the woods, broken only by the crunch of snow under our boots. As the day wore on, we began to find other signs that sent chills down my spine. Deep claw marks scored the trunks of trees, far too high up to have been made by a bear. In one small clearing, we found the remains of what might have been an elk, but it looked like it had been torn apart by something with incredible strength. "Jack," Steve said, his voice tight with barely contained fear, "maybe we should head back. This doesn't feel right." Part of me wanted to agree, to turn tail and run back to the safety of our camp, but a larger part, the hunter in me, needed to know what we were tracking. "Just a little further," I insisted. "We've got plenty of daylight left." That was my first mistake. We pressed on, following the tracks as they wound through the increasingly primeval forest. The sun sank lower in the sky, shadows lengthening around us. I checked my watch and cursed under my breath. We'd gone much further than I'd realized. "We need to turn back," I admitted to Steve. "We can pick this up again tomorrow." But as we turned to retrace our steps, I realized with growing horror that our own tracks had vanished. The snow that had been so perfect for tracking that morning was now working against us, a fresh layer already filling in our footprints. "No problem," I said, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. "We just need to head east. We'll hit the logging road eventually." We set off, moving as quickly as we dared through the deepening twilight, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all blurred together, and more than once we found ourselves going in circles. As full dark settled in, panic began to set in. We were lost, in temperatures that would soon plummet well below freezing, with only our day packs for supplies. I was about to suggest we try to make some sort of shelter for the night when we heard it. A howl split the night air, so loud and deep it seemed to shake the very ground. It started low, almost like a wolf's call, but rose to a pitch that no earthly animal should have been able to produce. Steve and I froze, eyes wide as we stared at each other in the gloom. "What the hell was that?" Steve whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, another howl answered the first, then another and another. Soon, the forest around us was alive with the sounds, coming from all directions. "Run!" I yelled, all thoughts of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we fled blindly through the dark forest. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in the face of our terror. But eventually, gasping for breath, we burst into a small clearing, and there, rising above us, was the full moon, casting an eerie silver light over the snow-covered ground. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. The moonlight would help us navigate, give us a chance to get our bearings. But as I turned to Steve, ready to formulate a plan, I saw his face go pale with horror. He was staring at something behind me, his mouth open in a silent scream. I turned slowly, already knowing that whatever I was about to see would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. In the moonlight, I could make out shaggy fur, matted and dark. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a massive barrel chest and arms that seemed too long for its body. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. It was a twisted amalgamation of wolf and man, a long snout filled with gleaming fangs, eyes that glowed with an unholy amber light, and ears that stood erect atop its skull. As I watched, frozen in terror, its muzzle pulled back in a snarl that was almost a grin. A werewolf. The rational part of my brain rebelled at the thought, insisting that such things couldn't exist. But the primal part, the part that recognized a predator when it saw one, knew the truth. For a long moment, we stood there, locked in a tableau of predator and prey. Then, with a speed that defied its massive size, it charged. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was rooted to the spot. The next I was crashing through the underbrush, Steve right beside me. Behind us, I could hear the creature's pursuit, the snapping of branches, the heavy thud of its footfalls, and worst of all, the eager panting of a beast on the hunt. We ran without direction or plan, our only thought to put distance between us and the monster at our heels. But we were tired, cold, and hopelessly lost. The werewolf, moving with preternatural speed and strength, was gaining on us with every step. Just as I felt my strength giving out, my foot caught on a hidden root. I went down hard, crying out as pain shot through my ankle. Steve skidded to a stop, turning back to help me. "Go!" I yelled, waving him off. "Get out of here!" But it was too late. As Steve reached down to pull me up, a dark shape burst from the trees behind him. There was a blur of motion, a spray of crimson on the snow, and then silence. I lay there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the werewolf loomed over me. This close, I could smell its hot, fetid breath, see the intelligence gleaming in its inhuman eyes. It knew it had won. I was helpless before it. As it reached for me with claws that could rend flesh from bone, a distant part of my mind noted the way the fur on its arm seemed to ripple and shift. Was it my terrified imagination? Or was the creature changing, its form fluid in the moonlight? I closed my eyes, not wanting to see the end coming, but instead of pain, I felt nothing. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The clearing was empty. No werewolf, no sign of Steve, not even any tracks in the snow save for our own. Had I imagined it all? But then I saw it. There, half buried in the snow, was a tuft of coarse, dark fur, and beside it, gleaming in the moonlight, was a single, massive claw. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Search and rescue found me the next day, delirious with cold and babbling about monsters in the woods. They never found Steve, or any sign of the creature I described. The official report chalked it up to hypothermia and trauma. A tragic accident, they said. Mountain lions were blamed for the unusual tracks and claw marks. But I know what I saw. I know what's really out there, hiding in the dark forests of the world. And now, when the moon is full, I lock my doors, shutter my windows, and pray that the howls I hear in the distance are just the wind, because some things once seen can never be unseen, and some predators, once they've caught your scent, never stop hunting. Story 13. The eyes appeared in the dark just after midnight. I was camping alone, deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be a few quiet days to clear my head. No phone, no people, just me and the wilderness. I'd done solo trips like this before, and had always found comfort in the isolation, but that night something felt different. From the moment the sun set and the shadows grew long, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That happens sometimes when you're out in the woods by yourself. The sounds of the forest at night, branches snapping, animals rustling in the underbrush, can make you think there's something out there watching you. But this was different. This was worse. I had set up camp in a small clearing, my tent just a few feet from the dying fire. The trees loomed around me, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I'd finished dinner a while ago and was sitting by the fire, enjoying the silence, when I first felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. I glanced around, scanning the forest, but all I saw was darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond it, the woods were an impenetrable wall of black. I told myself it was nothing, just the typical unease that came with being alone in the wilderness at night. I poked at the fire, trying to keep it alive a little longer. The crackle of the flames, a comforting sound in the stillness. But then I saw them, two glowing eyes, staring at me from the darkness just beyond the firelight. They were low to the ground, too low to belong to any animal I could think of, and they were unmoving, just staring. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the light from the fire bouncing off some animal's eyes, but these weren't like any animal eyes I'd seen before. They were too bright, too focused on me, as if whatever they belonged to was watching my every move. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly, and pointed it in the direction of the eyes. The beam cut through the darkness, but when it landed on the spot where the eyes had been, there was nothing there, just trees and underbrush, as still and empty as ever. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I swept the light back and forth, trying to catch another glimpse of whatever had been watching me, but the eyes were gone. The forest was quiet again, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I sat back down by the fire, my body tense, every sense on high alert. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Animals reflect light in strange ways at night, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The eyes had been too focused, too deliberate. I tried to brush it off, but the unease clung to me like a wet blanket. I kept my flashlight in my hand, its beam pointed out into the woods, just in case. After a while, the fire began to die down, and I knew I should get some sleep. I stoked the flames one last time, then reluctantly crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to burn itself out. But I couldn't sleep. Every rustle, every crack of a twig outside made me sit up, listening intently, waiting for the eyes to appear again. The fabric walls of the tent suddenly felt too thin, too fragile, as if they could be torn open at any moment. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, the darkness pressing in around me, and then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound just outside the tent, my breath caught in my throat. It was subtle, like something, or someone, moving slowly through the underbrush, trying not to be heard. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The shuffling came closer, circling the tent. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't dare move. I was too afraid of what I might see if I unzipped the tent door. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the fabric walls, but I couldn't see anything. The eyes from earlier flashed in my mind, and I knew deep down that it wasn't an animal. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to go away, but the sound continued, now accompanied by the faintest whisper. It was too quiet to make out any words, more like the wind passing through dry leaves, but it was there, and it was getting closer. I couldn't take it anymore. With a shaky hand, I reached for the zipper and slowly pulled it open, just enough to peek out. The fire had almost completely burned out, leaving only a few glowing embers. Beyond that, the forest was pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but the shuffling had stopped, as if whatever was out there knew I was looking. For a long moment, I stayed there, staring out into the darkness, my pulse racing, but the eyes were gone. The whispers were gone. Everything was still. I closed the tent again, lying back down with my heart still pounding in my chest. For a long time I just lay there, waiting for something to happen, but the night stretched on in silence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the unease from the night before lingered, like a bad dream that wouldn't quite fade. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, empty, peaceful, untouched by whatever had stalked me in the dark. But as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. I did a quick sweep of the camp, looking for any sign that something or someone had been nearby, but there was nothing, no tracks, no disturbed earth. It was as if the night before had never happened. But then I found something. Just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees began to thicken, I saw it, a small pile of rocks, carefully arranged in a neat circle, with a single black feather sticking out of the center. It wasn't there the day before. I was sure of that. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd find naturally in the forest. It felt deliberate, like a marker, a warning. I stared at it for a long time, my skin prickling with unease. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. Whatever it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I packed up the rest of my gear quickly, my movements hurried and anxious. I didn't want to stay here any longer than I had to. Something had been in those woods last night, something that wasn't an animal. As I hiked back down the trail, the forest felt different. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every now and then I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the glowing eyes again, but the trail remained empty. Still, The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end the entire way down. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me was still there, following just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I made it back to my car by midday, the unease still gnawing at my gut. I tossed my gear in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there for a moment, staring at the forest, the eyes, the whispers, the strange marker. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I just wanted to leave. As I drove away, the trees lining the road seemed to close in, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel it, that same presence, still watching me, still waiting. Whatever had been in the woods that night wasn't done with me, and as I drove further from the forest, one thing became terrifyingly clear. It never would be. Story 14, the world was on fire, and I was lost in the heart of it. Smoke stung my eyes and filled my lungs as I stumbled through the burning forest. But it wasn't until I saw those massive shapes moving through the haze that I realized the true danger wasn't the fire. It was what the flames had awakened. My name is Carlos Mendoza, and I've been a forest firefighter for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: raging infernos, emergency evacuations, the raw power of nature unleashed. But nothing in my years of training could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Stanislaus National Forest that fateful day. It started like any other call. Lightning had sparked a wildfire in a remote section of the forest, and our team was dispatched to contain it before it could spread to nearby communities. As we flew in on the helicopter, I could see the smoke rising in thick plumes, obscuring the landscape below. We hit the ground running, working to establish fire breaks and coordinate with the air support teams. The heat was intense, sweat pouring down our faces inside our protective gear, but this was what we were trained for, and despite the challenging conditions, we were making progress. I was operating one of our portable water pumps when everything went sideways. A sudden shift in the wind sent a wall of flames roaring towards us. In the chaos of the evacuation, I got separated from my team. 1 minute, I was running alongside my crew chief. The next, I was alone, surrounded by smoke and fire. I tried to radio for help, but all I got was static. The thick smoke must have been interfering with the signal. I knew protocol: find a safe area, wait for rescue. But as the flames closed in around me, I realized there was no safe area. I had to keep moving or be consumed by the fire. Hours passed as I pushed through the burning forest. My throat was raw from the smoke, my eyes stinging despite my protective goggles. I'd long since drained my water supply, and dehydration was setting in. But I forced myself to keep going, knowing that to stop was to die. As night fell, the forest took on an otherworldly quality. The flames cast long, dancing shadows, and the smoke turned the moon blood-red. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like staring into the maw of hell itself. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for what little clean air I could find. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just smoke and fatigue playing tricks on my mind. Dark shapes, massive and hulking, moving through the haze at the edge of the clearing. But as I watched, they solidified, taking on form and substance. They were huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. They moved with an eerie grace, stepping through the flames as if they were nothing more than a gentle breeze. But it was when one of them turned towards me that I felt true terror grip my heart. Its face was wrong, not quite human, not quite animal. A heavy brow ridge shadowed eyes that glowed with reflected firelight. The nose was flat and wide, and the jaw jutted out, giving it a primitive, ape-like appearance. But there was an intelligence in those eyes, a cold calculation that no mere animal should possess. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? The rational part of my brain rejected the idea, but the evidence was right there in front of me. As I watched, One of the creatures reached out and casually snapped a burning tree in half, as easily as I might break a twig. A twig snapping under my own foot broke the spell. The creature's head whipped around, those glowing eyes locking onto me. A low growl, barely audible over the roar of the fire, rumbled from its chest. I ran. I crashed through the burning underbrush, no longer caring about the flames that licked at my suit. Pure adrenaline pushed me forward as I heard heavy footfalls behind me. They were pursuing, and they were fast. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that smoke-filled hellscape. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but terror kept me moving. Every time I glanced back, I caught glimpses of those massive shapes loping through the flames, drawing ever closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the tree line. Ahead of me, I could see lights. A base camp set up to combat the fire. Safety, salvation. I tried to cry out, to alert them to my presence, but my smoke-ravaged throat produced nothing more than a weak croak. As I stumbled towards the camp, my legs finally gave out. I collapsed to the ground, my body pushed beyond its limits. As darkness crept in at the edges of my vision, I managed to turn my head back towards the forest. There, at the edge of the trees, I saw them. 3 massive figures wreathed in smoke and flame. They stood watching me for a long moment. Then as shouts rang out from the camp and people began to run towards me, the creatures melted back into the burning forest. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines and with an oxygen mask over my face. They told me I was lucky to be alive. Severe dehydration, smoke inhalation, second-degree burns over parts of my body. By all rights, I should have died out there in the fire. When I tried to tell them about what I'd seen, about the creatures in the flames, they exchanged worried glances. Hallucinations, they said. Not uncommon in cases of extreme stress and smoke inhalation. They assured me it wasn't real, that my mind had simply conjured up the images to cope with the trauma, but I know what I saw. And in the years since, I've heard whispers. Other firefighters who've caught glimpses of something massive moving through the smoke. Hikers finding strange footprints in areas ravaged by forest fires. Stories of ancient tribes who spoke of fire spirits, huge and powerful, that walked unharmed through the flames. I don't fight fires anymore, I can't. The sound of crackling flames, the smell of smoke, it all brings me back to that night. To those glowing eyes in the darkness, that sense of being hunted by something beyond human understanding. But sometimes, when the wildfires rage and I watch the news coverage from the safety of my home, I find myself searching the footage, looking for shapes in the smoke, for something moving where nothing should be able to survive, because I know they're out there, waiting, watching. Perhaps guarding something in the depths of the forests that we were never meant to find, and when the fires come, as they always do, they walk again. I've never told this story publicly before. Who would believe me? But I feel it needs to be told. As climate change worsens and the fires grow more frequent, more intense, I fear we may be awakening things that have slumbered for centuries. Things that may not be content to simply watch from the shadows anymore. So the next time you see a forest fire raging on the news, look closely. In the heart of the inferno, in the thick smoke and leaping flames, you might just catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Something huge, ancient and terrifyingly aware. And if you do, pray it doesn't see you too. Because once you've been marked by the watchers in the flames, you'll never truly escape. They'll be there in every flicker of firelight, every curl of smoke, waiting, watching, remembering. I know, because they remember me. And sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear their growls echoing through a burning forest, a reminder that there are some fires that can never truly be extinguished, and some mysteries that are better left unsolved. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, don't go looking for them, because if my experience taught me anything, it's that sometimes, when you stare into the fire, something stares back, and it might just follow you home. Story 15. The shadow moved before I did. I was out on a routine patrol in the park, the kind of quiet night that made you forget anything bad could ever happen in a place like this. The moon was high, casting silver light through the trees, and the forest seemed to breathe around me. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. No tourists to hassle with, no loud campers, just the sound of my boots crunching on the trail, and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But something was off that night. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but there was a weight in the air, something I couldn't shake. And then I saw it, a shadow, long, dark, and moving along the tree line, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was massive, larger than any animal I knew lived in these woods. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to track it, but the shadow slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the night. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been on the job for years and had seen my fair share of strange things in the woods, but nothing like this. Nothing that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, that made my heart hammer in my chest without me knowing why. I wasn't the kind to get spooked easily, but that shadow, it felt wrong. I forced myself to keep walking, my breath a little quicker than before, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Every few minutes, I'd glance behind me, certain that the shadow was following me. The trees, once comforting, now seemed like they were watching me, hiding something just out of sight. That's when the radio crackled at my side. I jumped, fumbling for the device. "Base, this is Ranger Davis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything's quiet out here, just checking in." More static. Then something that sounded like a low growl came through the speaker, followed by garbled words I couldn't make out. I stopped in my tracks, holding the radio up to my ear. "Base, say again." I didn't catch that. The growling continued, deeper this time, almost vibrating through the speaker. And then, through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Davis," my name. Distorted, broken, like someone or something was mimicking the sound of my voice. I lowered the radio, my heart thudding in my chest. I scanned the woods again, my flashlight flickering in and out. The air was so still now that even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. My gut screamed at me to leave, to turn back toward the ranger station and forget I ever saw that shadow. But I couldn't. I was too far in now, too curious, too stupid to just walk away. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, they were faint, barely more than a whisper against the ground, but they grew louder, more deliberate, heavy, slow, and coming from behind me. I turned, shining my light toward the trail, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. I waited, listening, my breath coming in shallow gasps now. The silence pressed in on me, thick and oppressive, like the whole forest was watching, waiting for something to happen. I started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps followed, closer now, and still just out of sight. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my hand shaking as I swung the beam wildly through the trees. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice cracking. "This isn't funny." No answer. Just the sound of those footsteps, keeping pace with mine, always staying just beyond the edge of the light. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The shadow. It moved between the trees, quick but deliberate, almost like it was circling me. I turned, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness before I could catch a full glimpse. My breath came in ragged gasps now, panic creeping into my mind despite every instinct telling me to stay calm. I had to get back to the station. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to figure it out alone in the dark. I quickened my pace, practically jogging down the trail now, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to stay focused on the path ahead. But the footsteps followed, louder, heavier, and then the growl, the same growl from the radio, echoed through the trees. Low, guttural, and far too close. I broke into a full sprint. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out, to get away from whatever was chasing me. The growling grew louder, the footsteps faster, crashing through the underbrush, as if whatever was following me wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. And then, just ahead, I saw it, something massive, moving in the shadows. For a split second, my light caught it. A huge figure, taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long, its eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. But before I could register what I was seeing, it vanished into the darkness again, leaving only the echo of its growl behind. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I forced myself to keep running. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, not with that thing out there. The ranger station was close now. I could see the faint glow of the lights through the trees. I pushed myself harder, my vision blurring as I burst through the tree line, slamming into the door and throwing it open. I collapsed inside, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away from the windows, my eyes darting around the room. The station was small, just a single room with a desk, a few chairs, and a radio. It felt like a safe haven compared to the open woods, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to stop whatever had been following me. I grabbed the rifle from the wall, my hands shaking as I checked the chamber, loaded. I clutched it tightly, staring out the window into the dark, waiting for the shadow to appear again, waiting for the growl. But the forest was still now, quiet, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, watching, but the shadow never came, the footsteps never returned. Eventually, I lowered the rifle, my breath still shaky, my body drenched in sweat. I slumped into a chair, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? What had followed me through the woods? The radio crackled again, startling me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it, hesitating for a moment before lifting it to my ear. "Base, this is Davis. Come in." More static. Then, through the crackle, that same low growl, "Davis!" My name again, distorted and broken, mimicking my own voice. And then, the growl. I dropped the radio, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed away from the desk. The sound was coming from the radio, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere, from outside, from inside, from the woods that surrounded the station. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare. I sat there, rifle in hand, staring out the window, waiting for the shadow to return, waiting for the footsteps, but nothing happened. The forest remained still, silent. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting there, my body stiff, my mind racing. The light of day felt like a reprieve, but I knew better. Whatever had followed me, whatever had called my name, it wasn't gone. It was just waiting, waiting for the night to fall again, waiting for me to make the mistake of going back out into those woods. But I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be going back. Not ever. Story 16. I never thought I'd die in a cabin in the woods, but as the roof creaks under the weight of something massive, claws tearing at the shingles, I realize this might be our last night alive. And the worst part. We came here to escape the dangers of the world, not to face something far worse. My name is Lily Chen, and 48 hours ago, my brother Max and I were excited for our Appalachian Trail adventure. We'd been planning this hike for months, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other after years of drifting apart. Max had always been the outdoorsy one, while I preferred the comfort of my city apartment and coding job. But he'd convinced me that this trip was just what we needed. The first day on the trail was everything Max had promised. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as we made our way through forests painted in reds and golds. We talked more in those hours than we had in the past year, laughing at old memories and sharing our hopes for the future. As evening approached, we started looking for a good spot to set up camp. That's when we stumbled upon the cabin. It wasn't on any of our maps, a small rustic structure nestled in a clearing. The wood was weathered, but it looked solid enough. "What do you think?" Max asked, eyeing the cabin with interest. "Might be nicer than sleeping on the ground." I hesitated. Something about the cabin made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "I don't know." "Shouldn't we stick to the trail?" Max grinned, already moving towards the door. "Come on, Lil, where's your sense of adventure? It'll be fine." That was my first mistake, letting my brother's enthusiasm override my instincts. The cabin's interior was surprisingly clean, if sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small kitchen area and a couple of bunks along the others. It was cozy, in a rugged sort of way. "See," Max said, dropping his pack, "way better than a tent." I had to admit the prospect of sleeping in a real bed was appealing after a long day of hiking. We set about making ourselves at home, Max getting a fire going while I prepared our freeze-dried dinner. As night fell, we sat by the fire, sharing stories and a flask of whiskey Max had snuck into his pack. The unease I'd felt earlier faded, replaced by a warm contentment. This wasn't so bad after all. We turned in early, exhausted from the day's hike. I drifted off to the sound of wind in the trees and Max's soft snoring from the other bunk. I'm not sure what woke me at first. Some animal sound, perhaps, or just the unfamiliarity of the place. But as I lay there in the darkness, I became aware of a heaviness in the air, a silence that felt wrong. Then I heard it, a soft thud from above, like something heavy settling its weight on the roof. I sat up, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, it came again. Thud, thud, thud. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the roof. "Max," I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "Max, wake up." He stirred, grumbling. "Whoa, what is it?" "There's something on the roof." That got his attention. He sat up, fully alert now. We both held our breath, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a new sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire cabin. Max moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he whispered. Maybe it's just a bear." I was about to respond when a massive shape dropped down in front of the window. All I caught was a glimpse of shaggy fur and glowing eyes before Max stumbled back with a strangled cry. "What the fuck was that?" he gasped. Before I could answer, the whole cabin shook as something slammed into the roof. Dust and splinters rained down as whatever it was began tearing at the shingles. Max grabbed his hunting knife, the only weapon we had, and moved towards the door. "We have to make a run for it," he said, his voice tight with fear. I wanted to argue, to say we were safer inside, but a quick glance up at the groaning roof changed my mind. Whatever was up there, it was big, and it was trying to get in. Max reached for the door handle, but before he could turn it, something outside slammed into the door with enough force to make the whole wall shudder. He stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. "The back window," I suggested, already moving towards it. But as I reached it, I saw another shape moving in the darkness outside. We were surrounded. The attack came from all sides then. The roof creaked and groaned as massive weights moved across it. Claws scraped at the walls, and the door shuddered under repeated impacts. We huddled in the center of the cabin, backs to each other, Max clutching his pitiful knife while I held a heavy iron skillet I'd grabbed from the kitchen area. Not that either would do much good against whatever was out there. "What are they?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Max shook his head, his face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. "I don't know. But they're smart. They're coordinating, trying to find a way in." As if to emphasize his point, there was a loud crack as one of the roof beams gave way. A large, furred arm punched through the new hole, claws gleaming wickedly as it swiped at the air. I bit back a scream, pressing closer to Max. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist in the real world. And yet, as another arm broke through, followed by a snarling muzzle filled with sharp teeth, I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. "Bigfoot," Max breathed, his voice filled with a mix of terror and awe. "But that's impossible." "Hate to break it to you," I said, hysteria bubbling up in my voice, "but I don't think they got the memo about being impossible." The creatures, I couldn't bring myself to actually think of them as Bigfoot, redoubled their efforts. The cabin shook with the force of their assault. It was only a matter of time before they broke through. "We have to do something," I said, desperately looking around for anything we could use to defend ourselves. Max's eyes fell on the fireplace. "Fire," he said suddenly. "Wild animals are afraid of fire, right?" It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We scrambled to get the fire going, using the last of our lighter fluid to set the logs ablaze. As the flames grew, casting flickering shadows around the cabin, the attack seemed to lessen. For a moment, I dared to hope it might work, but then a face appeared at one of the windows, a face that was at once ape-like and disturbingly human. Eyes that held an intelligence far beyond that of any animal stared in at us, and in that moment, I knew that fire wasn't going to save us. The window shattered inward as a massive arm punched through. Max shouted, slashing at it with his knife, but the blade seemed to do little more than anger the creature. It roared, a sound so loud and deep it shook my very bones. I swung my skillet, connecting with the arm with a sickening crunch. The creature pulled back, but I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. There were more of them, and the cabin wouldn't hold much longer. "Lily," Max said, his voice oddly calm. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. I should have listened to you about the cabin." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that neither of us could have predicted this, but before I could speak, the roof finally gave way with a thunderous crash. Moonlight flooded the cabin as a large section of the ceiling collapsed, and there, silhouetted against the night sky, were the creatures, 3 of them, massive and terrifying, peering down at us with those 2 intelligent eyes. For a long moment, everything was still. We stared up at them, and they stared down at us. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, sure that any second they would leap down and tear us apart. But they didn't move. They just watched. And somehow, that was even more terrifying. A distant howl broke the silence, and as one, the creatures turned towards the sound. They seemed to communicate with each other in a series of grunts and growls, and then, to my utter disbelief, they began to retreat. We stood there, frozen in shock, as the creatures lumbered away into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls faded into the distance, leaving us alone in the ruined cabin. What just happened?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Max shook his head, looking as bewildered as I felt. "I don't know, but I think we just got a warning." As we huddled there in the destroyed cabin, waiting for dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something much bigger than ourselves, that we'd crossed a line we didn't even know existed. We left as soon as it was light enough to see, practically running down the trail. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest ranger station, babbling about monsters in the woods. They didn't believe us, of course. Chalked it up to an animal attack, maybe a bear, but I know what we saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the deep woods of the Appalachian Trail, something is watching, waiting. I won't be going back to those woods, but sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself wondering about what's really out there in the wilderness, and about why, when they had us at their mercy, those creatures chose to let us go. Story 17. The first howl came from somewhere deep in the hills, too far away to worry about. At least, that's what we told ourselves. We were a group of friends camping in the backcountry, miles away from the nearest town. We'd done this kind of thing a dozen times before, just us, the open wilderness, and a couple of nights under the stars. It was the kind of trip we all looked forward to. No cell service, no responsibilities, just a chance to breathe and forget about the world for a while. But that first howl, It was different. It echoed through the valley, long and low, the kind of sound that seemed to vibrate in your chest, like it came from something much bigger than the coyotes or wolves we were used to hearing out here. We were sitting around the fire, laughing and telling stories, but when that howl reached our ears, the laughter died. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The crackling of the fire, suddenly the loudest sound around. "Must be a wolf," Tim said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Wolves don't come this far south," Jake muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "Not in years." No one said anything for a while after that. We just sat there, listening, waiting to hear if the howl would come again. The forest was quiet, too quiet, like everything else had gone still, listening just like we were. Then came the second howl. This one was closer, too close. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and stays there. It was longer than the first one, deeper, and it felt wrong. I glanced at the others. Tim was staring into the trees, his brow furrowed. Jake had stopped poking the fire and was looking out toward the hills, his face tense. "You hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "I heard it." For a moment, we all just sat there, the fire casting flickering shadows around us. There was something out there, something big, and it was getting closer. "I'm sure it's just a coyote," Jenny said, trying to break the tension, but her voice wavered. We all knew it wasn't a coyote. Coyotes yipped and barked. They didn't howl like that. "We should keep the fire going," Tim said, throwing another log onto the flames. "Just in case." We nodded in agreement, all of us silently deciding that none of us were going to bed just yet. The fire crackled and popped as we sat around it, listening for any other sounds from the hills. I tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping over me, but it wouldn't go away. The night felt different now, darker, heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and every snap of a twig made me flinch. Another hour passed, maybe more. The fire was still burning strong, but no one spoke. We were all on edge, our ears straining for any sign of that howl again. But it didn't come. Just the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Then, just as I was starting to relax, there was a crash in the woods behind us. We all jumped to our feet, turning toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the dark. For a second, everything went still again. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding fast and hard. Then another sound, a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from somewhere just beyond the light of our camp. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles were white. "I don't know," I muttered, scanning the trees. My light flickered across the trunks, casting long, eerie shadows, but I didn't see anything. Just darkness. "It's moving," Jake said, his voice tight. I strained to listen, and then I heard it too, the sound of something large, moving through the trees, slow and deliberate, like it didn't care if we knew it was there. The growling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround us, coming from all sides. "Back to the tents," Tim said, his voice shaking. "Now." We didn't argue. We backed up slowly, keeping our flashlights pointed toward the trees, but we couldn't see anything. Whatever was out there was staying just out of sight, but it was close enough that we could feel it, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on us. As we reached the tents, the growling stopped, and for a brief moment the forest went silent again. I glanced at Tim, who was clutching a hatchet, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get the hell out of here," he said. "And go where?" Jenny snapped. "We're miles from the car, and whatever that is, it's between us and the trail." She was right. We were trapped out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no way to defend ourselves and no idea what was stalking us. Another howl split the air, so loud and close now that it made my chest vibrate. The sound echoed off the trees, sending a wave of panic through me. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my heart racing, and then the eyes appeared. Two glowing orbs in the darkness, just beyond the firelight, staring at us with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. Too deliberate, too human. "What the hell is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "Whatever it is, it's watching us," I muttered, my throat tight with fear. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared, glowing faintly in the dark. I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were studying us, deciding what to do next. Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the thing moved. It barreled through the trees, faster than anything that size should be able to move, its growls shaking the ground beneath our feet. We scattered, running in different directions, panicked and blind, not thinking, just trying to get away. I sprinted toward the trees, my flashlight swinging wildly in front of me as I tried to find some place to hide. Behind me, I could hear the others shouting, their voices filled with terror, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn around. The only thing I could think about was getting as far away from that thing as possible. The growling grew louder, closer. I stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but I caught myself and kept running. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning from the effort. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something massive moving through the trees. I whipped my flashlight toward it, and for a brief moment I saw it. A huge, hulking figure, covered in matted fur, its limbs impossibly long, its eyes glowing white in the dark. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, part animal, part something else, something wrong. It let out a howl that shook the trees, and I ran harder, my legs burning, my chest tight with fear. I didn't stop until I burst into the clearing where our camp was. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows across the tents. Tim was there, panting, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Where are the others?" I gasped, trying to catch my breath. Tim shook his head. "I don't know. They ran—" Before he could finish, the growling came again, this time right behind us. We turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing, its breath coming in ragged, hungry gasps. It towered over us, its body misshapen and twisted, its face half hidden in the shadows. But I could see enough. The Wendigo. Tim and I didn't speak. We didn't move. We just stood there, frozen in place, staring at the thing that had been stalking us all night. It took a step forward, its massive hands curling into claws, and I knew in that moment that we weren't going to make it out of here. But then, just as it seemed ready to strike, the fire crackled, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The Wendigo stopped, its eyes narrowing at the flames. It let out a low, guttural growl, then backed away slowly, disappearing into the trees, its glowing eyes the last thing to fade into the dark. For a long time, neither of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the spot where it had vanished, too scared to believe we were still alive. By the time the others found their way back to the camp, the fire had burned out completely, leaving us in darkness. No one spoke about what we'd seen, about the thing that had stalked us through the woods. We packed up the next morning in silence, leaving the hills behind us. But as we hiked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Wendigo was still watching, waiting for the next group of campers, foolish enough to wander too far into its territory. And I knew, deep down, that we'd only just escaped. Story 18. The earth trembled beneath my feet, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very heart of the canyon. As I watched in horror, the massive figure on the cliff edge let out a bone-chilling roar, and the world began to crumble around me. In that moment, I realized that some secrets of nature are better left undiscovered. My name is Dr. Elena Reyes, and I'm a geologist specializing in sedimentary rock formations. For years, I've been fascinated by the hidden stories trapped in layers of stone, the tales of ancient seas and long-extinct creatures preserved in the earth. But nothing in my years of study could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of Black Rock Canyon. It all started 3 weeks ago when my research team picked up some unusual seismic activity in a remote area of the southwest. The readings were unlike anything we'd seen before. Sporadic tremors that didn't match any known geological patterns. Intrigued, I volunteered to lead a small expedition to investigate. The journey to Black Rock Canyon was arduous. Miles of dusty roads gave way to rough terrain that our jeep could barely navigate. By the time we reached the canyon rim, I was covered in a fine layer of red dust, my clothes sticking to my skin in the oppressive heat. But any discomfort was forgotten as I got my first look at the canyon. It was breathtaking, sheer walls of striated rock plunging down to a winding river far below. Layers of red, orange, and purple stone told the story of millions of years of geological history. We set up base camp on the canyon rim, and I spent the first few days taking samples and readings. The tremors continued, small shudders that ran through the ground at irregular intervals. It was puzzling. There were no fault lines in the area that could account for the activity. On the fourth day, I decided to rappel down into the canyon for a closer look at some intriguing rock formations. My research assistant, Jake D., would monitor my progress from above while I explored. The descent was exhilarating. As I lowered myself down the sheer rock face, I felt a familiar thrill of discovery. Each layer of stone I passed was a page in Earth's history book, and I was reading it firsthand. About halfway down, I noticed something odd, a series of deep grooves in the rock face, too uniform to be natural erosion. They looked almost like claw marks, but that was impossible. No known animal could have made marks that size, especially not on sheer rock. I shook off the unease and continued my descent. Finally, my feet touched the canyon floor. I unclipped from my harness and radioed up to Jake that I'd made it safely. The bottom of the canyon was eerily quiet. The river that had carved this massive gorge was now just a trickle, snaking its way through tumbled boulders. The air was still and heavy, amplifying every small sound. I made my way along the canyon floor, taking samples and photos. The unusual markings continued, growing more frequent as I moved deeper into the gorge. Some were high up on the walls, others at ground level. All were far too large to have been made by any animal I knew of. As I rounded a bend in the canyon, I froze. There, half buried in the sand, was a footprint, but not just any footprint. It was enormous, easily 4 feet long, with what looked like opposable toes. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No known primate could have left a print that size. And in this environment, it was impossible. I was so focused on the print that I almost missed the sound. A low rumble, more felt than heard, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet. One of the tremors we'd been detecting, but this close. It didn't feel like any geological event I'd ever experienced. It felt alive. Rocks clattered down from above, making me jump. I looked up, squinting against the glare of the sun, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a silhouette, a massive shape moving along the canyon rim, but as my eyes adjusted, details began to emerge. It was huge, easily 15 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a cross between an ape and a man. Shaggy fur covered its frame, and its arms were impossibly long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be real. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it, these were myths, not flesh and blood creatures, and certainly not something of this size. But as I stood there, frozen in disbelief, the creature turned its head. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes, intelligent, aware, and looking directly at me. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I felt like a mouse that had just locked eyes with a hawk. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature's mouth opened, and a roar unlike anything I've ever heard echoed through the canyon. It was deep, primal, a sound that seemed to come from the dawn of time itself. The very air vibrated with its force, and then the world began to shake. It started slowly at first, a trembling in the ground beneath my feet, but it quickly grew in intensity. Rocks began to fall from the canyon walls, small at first, then larger. The roar of falling stone mingled with the creature's ongoing cry. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. "Jake!" I screamed into my radio. "Jake, do you copy? We need to evacuate now!" Static was my only answer. Either the equipment had been damaged by whatever force was shaking the canyon, or Jake was... I couldn't bring myself to finish that thought. I ran, stumbling over the increasingly unstable ground. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, its heavy footfalls sending shockwaves through the earth. It was coming down into the canyon. Boulders crashed down around me as I fled. The once solid walls of the canyon were coming apart, centuries of geological stability undone in moments. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. I reached the spot where I had rappelled down, only to find my rope had been severed by falling rocks. I was trapped. The shaking intensified. A deafening crack split the air as a massive fissure opened up in the canyon floor. I scrambled back, barely avoiding falling into the abyss that had suddenly appeared at my feet. Through the dust and chaos, I saw the creature descending the canyon wall. It moved with impossible grace for something so large, using its long arms to swing from outcropping to outcropping. Each time it landed, the tremors grew stronger. I was cornered, trapped between the advancing creature and the growing chasm behind me. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die, but then something unexpected happened. The creature stopped its advance, cocking its head to one side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. It let out another roar, but this one was different, almost mournful. To my amazement, it began to retreat, climbing back up the crumbling canyon wall. As it neared the rim, it paused, turning to look back at me one last time. In that moment, I saw something in its eyes that I never expected, intelligence and what seemed almost like regret. Then it was gone, disappearing over the rim of the canyon. Almost immediately, the tremors began to subside. The rain of rocks slowed, then stopped. An eerie quiet settled over the canyon, broken only by the occasional crunch of settling stone. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until I heard the distant whoomp-whoomp of helicopter blades that I snapped back to reality. The rescue team found me hours later, dehydrated and in shock. They had to airlift me out of the canyon, the floor too unstable for a ground evacuation. As we rose into the air, I got one last look at Black Rock Canyon. The once majestic walls were scarred and broken, huge sections collapsed into piles of rubble. It looked like a war zone. Jake, thank God, was okay. He'd been knocked unconscious by falling debris, but had managed to call for help when he came to. The rest of our team had been evacuated safely as well. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to make sense of what I'd seen. The official report blamed the canyon's collapse on an unexpected seismic event. My photos and samples had been lost in the chaos, leaving me with no proof of what I'd encountered. But I know what I saw. I know that somewhere out there, something ancient and powerful walks the earth. Something that can shake mountains and bring canyons crumbling down. I've since left fieldwork behind, focusing on lab analysis and teaching. But sometimes, when I'm lecturing about geological forces, I catch myself hesitating, because I know now that not all of Earth's forces can be explained by science. Some secrets are older, wilder, and far more alive than we ever imagined. And sometimes, those secrets are better left undisturbed. Story 19. The first rip through the tent fabric sounded like a gunshot in the night. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the heavy breathing of something massive just inches away, I realized our weekend camping trip had turned into a fight for survival. My name is Alex, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. There's something about disconnecting from the world and immersing yourself in nature that I find irresistible. So when my best friends, Sarah and Mike, suggested we take a weekend trip to Shadowpine National Forest, I jumped at the chance. We arrived at the campsite Friday afternoon, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The forest was a riot of color, leaves turning shades of red and gold. As we set up our tents and unpacked our gear, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always comes over me in the wilderness. "This is perfect," Sarah said, taking a deep breath of pine-scented air. "I can't believe we have this whole place to ourselves." She was right. We hadn't seen another soul since we'd turned off the main road. It was just us and the vast, silent forest. We spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. An owl hooted in the distance, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. "Hey, did you guys remember to put the food in the bear cache?" I asked, as we prepared to turn in for the night. Mike nodded, yawning. "Yeah, it's all locked up tight. No midnight snacks for Yogi Bear." We laughed and said our good nights, retreating to our respective tents. As I snuggled into my sleeping bag, I felt content. This was shaping up to be a perfect weekend. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving around our campsite. At first, I thought it might be Mike or Sarah, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Fully alert now, I lay still, straining my ears. Whatever it was big. I could hear branches snapping under its weight as it moved. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinct noise of our bear cache being torn open. "Ah, guys," I whispered urgently, hoping my voice would carry to the other tents. "Wake up! Something's in the camp." I heard rustling from Sarah's tent, followed by her sleepy voice. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, there was a tremendous crash. Whatever had broken into our food cache was now ransacking the campsite. I could hear our cooking gear being knocked over, backpacks being ripped open. "Oh my God," Mike's voice came from the other tent, tight with fear. "What is that?" I slowly, carefully unzipped my tent flap just enough to peek out. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. It was massive, far larger than any bear I'd ever seen. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a shaggy, fur-covered body and long, powerful arms. But it wasn't a bear. It stood upright, its movements too human-like. As I watched, frozen in terror, it turned towards my tent. Two eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight. They were set too high off the ground to be a normal animal, and they held an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. I let the tent flap fall closed, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the creature must be able to hear it. "Guys," I whispered, as quietly as I could, "don't make a sound. There's something out there. I think it might be a Bigfoot." "A what?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Alex? That's not funny." "I'm not joking," I hissed back. "Just stay still and quiet. Maybe it'll leave." For a long moment, the only sound was the creature's heavy breathing and the occasional crunch as it continued to devour our food supplies. Then, suddenly, it went quiet. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where it had gone. Had it left, or was it still out there, waiting? A shadow fell across my tent. Something large was standing right outside. I held my breath, not daring to move a muscle. I could hear its breathing, smell its musky animal odor. It was so close I could have reached out and touched it through the thin fabric of the tent. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we were locked in this terrifying tableau. Me, paralyzed with fear inside my fragile nylon shelter, and the creature, massive and unknowable, just on the other side. Then, without warning, a claw ripped through the fabric of my tent. I couldn't hold back a scream as the creature's hand, if you could call it that, punched through the tent. It was huge, covered in coarse hair, with fingers ending in wickedly curved claws. The hand groped around inside the tent, searching. I pressed myself against the far side, trying to stay out of its reach, but the tent was small, and there was nowhere to hide. Just as I felt those claws brush against my sleeping bag, there was a shout from outside. Mike had emerged from his tent, waving a burning branch from our campfire and yelling at the top of his lungs. The creature withdrew its hand with a snarl, turning to face this new threat. I could hear it moving, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. "Run!" Mike shouted. "Get out of the tents and run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I burst out of my shredded tent, nearly colliding with Sarah, who had also emerged. In the chaos, I caught another glimpse of the creature. It was even more terrifying in full view, at least 8 feet tall, with a massive, barrel-shaped chest and arms that hung down to its knees. We ran blindly into the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the creature's roar, felt the vibrations of its pursuit through the ground. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in the face of our terror. But eventually, gasping for breath, we burst out of the tree line and onto the road where we'd parked our car. "The keys!" Sarah gasped. "Who has the car keys?" With shaking hands, I fished the keys out of my pocket. We piled into the car, and I gunned the engine, tires spinning on the gravel as we took off down the road. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, I saw it one last time. The creature stood watching us, its eyes glowing in the reflection of our tail lights. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness of the trees. We drove straight through the night, not stopping until we reached the safety of the city. None of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We debated whether to report it, but who would believe us? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, but we made a pact to never camp in those woods again. I still go camping, but things are different now. I'm more cautious, more aware of the shadows at the edge of the firelight, because I know now that the wilderness holds secrets, ancient, powerful things that lurk just beyond the reach of our understanding. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it truly a Bigfoot, a creature of legend made real? Or was it something else, something even older and more mysterious? I don't have answers to these questions. But I do know this: the next time you're in the woods and you hear a branch snap in the darkness, or catch a whiff of a musky animal scent on the breeze, pay attention, because you never know what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. And if you hear heavy footsteps in the night or see eyes glowing in the darkness, don't try to be a hero. Run, run, and don't look back. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are best left undisturbed in the wild places of the world. As for me, I'll keep camping, keep exploring. But now, when I zip up my tent at night, I say a little prayer. Not just for my own safety, but for the creature too, because in a world that's becoming smaller and more explored every day, where can a legend hide? Perhaps, in the end, we're not so different, both of us just trying to find our place in a world that's not quite ready to accept the impossible. Story 20. The ranger didn't look right. I was about 5 miles deep into the forest when I first saw him. He was standing at the edge of the trail, half hidden by the trees, as if he had just appeared out of nowhere. There was something off about the way he stood, too still, too rigid, like he was waiting for something. My heart jumped when I saw him because I hadn't expected to run into anyone this far from the main trail, especially not at this time of day. "Evening," he said, stepping into the path as I approached. His voice was calm, but there was a strange flatness to it, like he was reciting a line from memory. "Evening," I replied, forcing a smile, though my unease grew the closer I got. His uniform was typical of the park rangers out here, green and brown, with the standard patches, but something about him didn't sit right. His eyes, they were too intense, too focused on me, like he was studying my every movement. "You know," he continued, "there's been a warning out about dangerous animals in this area. You shouldn't be out here alone." I stopped a few feet away, gripping the straps of my backpack tighter. Dangerous animals. I hadn't heard anything about that. And why would a ranger be standing out here alone, without any gear, without a radio? "Thanks for the warning," I said, trying to sound casual, "but I'm only another mile or so from my campsite. I'll be out of here by morning." He didn't blink, just stared at me with those unblinking, too wide eyes. There was something wrong about his face, something I couldn't put my finger on. His features looked off, almost like they didn't belong to him. His smile seemed too tight, his skin too pale under the fading light. "You should head back now," he said, stepping forward, his voice colder than before. "Before it gets dark." I felt my stomach twist, every instinct in me screaming that something wasn't right. The air around him felt wrong, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I nodded, trying not to let my fear show. "Yeah, I'll do that," I said, backing up a step. He didn't move, just kept watching me, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking. I turned, forcing myself to walk away calmly, though every part of me wanted to run. The trail ahead seemed to stretch out forever, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped below the treetops. I glanced back after a few yards, expecting to see him still standing there, but he was gone, just vanished. A chill crept up my spine. I looked around, but the forest was empty, silent, too silent. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, had disappeared. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I quickened my pace, my heart thudding in my chest. The campsite was only a mile ahead. I just needed to get there, start a fire, and maybe I'd feel a little more sane. But that feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that ranger lurking in the trees, but each time there was nothing. Just shadows, growing darker as the light faded. Then I heard the footsteps, soft at first, barely more than a whisper of movement behind me, but they were there, steady, deliberate, and far too close. I stopped, listening, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped too. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods, the trail winding behind me, and the growing darkness. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I started walking again, faster this time, my heart pounding harder with every step. The footsteps returned, louder now, matching my pace. Whoever, or whatever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky, even though I already knew no one would answer. The footsteps stopped again. Silence. I kept moving, practically jogging now, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain. There were no other rangers out here. I knew that for a fact. The park office had said they weren't sending anyone into this section until later in the week. So who was that man? And why had he disappeared like that? I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw him again. The same ranger, standing perfectly still in the middle of the path ahead, just a few yards away. My blood ran cold. "Thought I told you to head back," he said, his voice unnervingly calm, as if he hadn't just been standing behind me minutes ago. "It's dangerous out here," I froze, gripping my flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. I thought you were behind me," I stammered, my mouth dry. He didn't respond, just stood there, staring at me with those same unblinking eyes, his face unreadable. My skin prickled with fear. The way he looked at me, it wasn't normal. It was like he was wearing a mask, trying to pretend to be human, but something was off. Something was horribly wrong. "I'm heading to my campsite," I said, my voice wavering. "It's just up ahead." "You need to leave," he said, stepping forward, his tone cold and flat. "Now." I took a step back, my pulse racing. There was something wrong with him, something inhuman, the way he moved, the way he spoke. It wasn't right. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the campsite anymore. I just needed to get away. I sprinted down the trail, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears. Behind me, I could hear him following, those heavy, deliberate footsteps growing louder, faster. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, running after me. But it wasn't just running. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like his body wasn't meant to move that way. And his eyes, those glowing, hollow eyes, were fixed on me, unblinking. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I could see the trailhead up ahead, the path widening, but the footsteps were getting closer. He was gaining on me. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tripped, crashing hard onto the forest floor, the breath knocked out of me. My flashlight flew from my hand, rolling into the underbrush. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to get up, but before I could move, I felt it, a cold, clawed hand gripping my ankle. I screamed, kicking out, trying to pull myself free, but the grip tightened, pulling me back. I looked up, and there he was, looming over me, his face twisted into something monstrous, his mouth stretching too wide, his eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. "You need to leave," he repeated, but this time his voice was distorted, wrong. It wasn't even human anymore. I kicked harder, my foot connecting with something solid, and his grip loosened just enough for me to scramble free. I didn't look back. I just ran, adrenaline surging through my veins as I sprinted down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trailhead was close. I could see the faint outline of my car in the distance, the last bit of light fading from the sky. I pushed myself harder, my legs shaking, my mind racing with fear. Behind me, the footsteps continued, faster, more frantic. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it just as something hit the window. Hard. I looked up. And there he was, staring at me through the glass, his face pressed against it, his eyes glowing in the dark, his mouth opened wide, too wide, and I could hear that same distorted voice, whispering through the glass. "You need to leave." I started the car, slamming my foot on the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove straight through the night. The image of his twisted face burned into my mind, his voice still echoing in my ears. By the time I reached town, the sun was just beginning to rise, but I didn't feel safe until I was miles away from those woods. I never went back. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't a ranger, it wasn't human, and it didn't want me there.